Climate and Emissions in Reduction in Agriculture online forum. My name is Anwen Lovett and I manage CRSPI. For those of you who don't know what CRSPI is, it's the Climate Research Strategy for Primary Industries. It's a partnership that's been around for about 10 years and it involves the Rural Research and Development Corporations, state, territory and federal agencies for agriculture and the CSIRO. The partners in CRSPI work together to address issues that are affecting the entire agricultural sector. So looking at not only climate adaptation, but also emissions reduction, and increasingly, how do we actually integrate adapting to the changing climate while also reducing the carbon footprint of production. CRSPI does two things. We develop up collaborative research projects, such as the common accounting methods in greenhouse gases, that you'll hear a bit more about tomorrow. And we also share information, which is the purpose of this forum. So pre-COVID, we used to run conferences every 2 years. Unfortunately, our 2020 conference fell victim to COVID, but we're back again this year and we're kicking off with this online forum and we'll be thinking about other events later in this year. Before I hand over to our first chair, I'd just like to do some housekeeping. I'd like to introduce to you Katie McRobert. She will appear from time to time. The Australian Farm Institute is providing us with the back-end function of Zoom over the next 2 days. So when we need her, Katie will appear. AFI are also producing a summary report of the forum that we will be able to share with you all. In terms of how you actually get involved today, please use the Q&A function that you'll see at the bottom of your screens. While you're listening to presenters, start putting your thoughts and questions into the Q&A. The chair for each session will be scanning that chat and we'll be picking out questions to pose to our presenters when they have finished. Just to let you know, we are recording all of the presentations and our plan is to put them up on the CRSPI website after the event, but we're not going to be recording the Q&A. Okay, so it's my pleasure to move us into session one. I couldn't come up with a more creative title, so I just called it The Big Picture. We have 4 fantastic speakers for you this morning. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Margo Andrae, who will be chairing this session. Margo is the Chief Executive Officer of Australian Pork Limited, who have now established a strong agenda for tackling not only carbon emissions, but have also set ambitious zero waste targets. Prior to commencing with APL, Margo held positions with the Cattle Council of Australia, CSIRO, University of New South Wales, Rural Industries R&D Corporation, and the Queensland Local Government. She has extensive experience and networks across primary industries, regional Australia and research environments. Welcome, Margo.
Good morning, all, and thank you, Anwen. It's so lovely to be here and be able to open the session for the CRSPI conference. It's wonderful to see climate change on everyone's agenda, and we have a fantastic lineup for you today. So I've had the pleasure of the opening session. And so I'll start by introducing our first speaker, and we'll be speaking for about 15 minutes. And then as we go through the speakers, they'll enlighten you on the wonderful work they're doing. And then you'll have the opportunity for questions, as Emwen said. So pleasure to kick it off. So let's get started. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Mark Howden. Mark is the director of the new ANU Institute for Climate, Emergency and Disaster Solutions. The role of the Institute is to facilitate, lead and support research, teaching and engagement on how we can address climate change, disasters and the transformation of our energy systems. Mark is also the Honorary Professor at Melbourne University, a Vice Chair of the Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, as many of you would know, and a member of the ACT Climate Change Council. He was on the US Federal Advisory Committee for the 3rd National Climate Assessment and contributes to several major national, international science and policy advisories. So welcome, Mark. I'll hand over to you.
Hi, Margo, and hello, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. So what I'm going to cover today is just a really brief snapshot of climate change issues, and so I'll just pull up the sort of presentation here, and hopefully this will go to big screen. Oopsie, I'll have to go back. And so is that showing up as a full screen? All good? Fantastic.
You've got it, Mark.
So it's a really quick sort of survey of the sort of status of climate change. So it's a quick update in relation to Australian agriculture, just to sort of negotiate the uncertainties ahead of us a little. So the first thing I'd point out is that the main driver of anthropogenic or human-induced climate change, which is carbon dioxide emissions, have been going up really significantly over decades. So going back 3 decades, they're around about 22 billion tonnes. Pre-COVID, they were about 36 billion tonnes from fossil fuels and cement manufacture, that sort of thing. COVID knocked that back a little. So it took it back globally about 7%, and in Australia between 3 and 4%, largely because transport had a big hit with the lockdowns that happened in many countries. And whereas other industries largely went on fairly much as they were, with obvious modifications. So our expectation, though, because it was largely a transport thing and there was not structural change driven by COVID, is that this will bounce back pretty much to where it was in the forthcoming years. And what that does is it commits us to further climate change. To actually stop climate change, we actually have to take this curve of 36 billion tonnes a year and take it close down to zero. And that's because when we emit one of these tonnes of greenhouse gases, of carbon dioxide, about a quarter sits in the atmosphere. Sorry, a quarter gets absorbed by the oceans, a quarter gets absorbed by the land, and half sits in the atmosphere. And it lasts in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, which means there's a residue from this year's emissions, which adds to last year's emissions, which adds to the previous year's emissions. And so we build up carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that rate of build-up is really substantial. So when I was born, it was 317 parts per million. Now it's 417 parts per million. So it's gone up 100 parts per million in my lifetime. So it's almost a third in my lifetime. And that's a huge amount of change. And we've known for a long, long time that if we put in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases like methane, nitrous oxide into the atmosphere, we'll warm the Earth. And so we've first figured this out in the early 1800s. And there's a lot of science which goes towards confirming that since. So when we actually look at this temperature record, we can see the fingerprint of human influences through greenhouse gas emissions on the global temperature. So this is an average of the 4 main temperature records across the globe. And you can see that last year was the equal hottest on record. It was 1.2 to 4 degrees above the long-term average. And that was equal to 2016, which was actually an El Nino year. Last year being a La Nina tends to actually keep temperatures down compared with El Ninos, which tend to push temperatures up. So in the absence of last year being a La Nina, we probably would have had another record temperature across the globe. And to put that in context, that 1.24 degrees is like a quarter of an ice age, but in the other direction. So an ice age drops global temperatures by about 5 degrees. We've gone up about a quarter of that. So it's in the other direction. But an ice age fundamentally changes the face of the Earth. And we've done a quarter of that, but in the other direction. So what sound like small numbers actually make a huge difference in terms of how the Earth works. Now, here in Australia, it wasn't a record temperature. That was the previous year. It was the 4th warmest on record. So it was still pretty warm on average across Australia. So we're similar to the globe in terms of what's happening with temperatures. Now, if we actually think about temperature in agriculture, it's often the extremes which really matter, the hot extremes and the cold extremes. And so this is a graph which comes straight from the Bureau of Meteorology website, which just shows the area of Australia in any given year, going back to 1910, which was experiencing what we think of as an extremely hot year, one of the 10% of hottest years in the average that the Bureau uses. And you can see if we go back, say, 50 or 100 years, that a relatively small proportion of Australia in aerial terms, like as a proportion of the area, would experience a particularly hot year in any given year. So you get a few years which are reasonably hot, but not right across Australia. And in contrast, over the recent years, you can see that most of Australia now, in most years, is experiencing what would have used to have been thought of as an extremely hot year. So these hot extremes are getting more frequent and they're covering more area across Australia, as you'd expect with a higher temperature. Now, but it's not just that the hot extremes are increasing, but also the cold extremes are increasing in some areas, southwest WA and southeast Australia, and as a function of climate change. And so this is work by Steve Crimp for his PhD. And what this shows is this particular location is for Wagga, just west of Canberra. And it shows screen temperature on the bottom. So 2 degrees is a light frost, -2 is a heavy frost. And on the vertical axis, it's the day of year. So day 180 is roughly the middle of the year. Day 300 is around the start of November. And the little triangle indicates for the decade of the 1950s, the date of last frost, or the 10 percentile date, and the temperature of that. So it gives a very quick snapshot of frost risk in that decade. Now, what I'll do is I'll just step through the decades to show you how this is changing in this location. That's the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and year 2000s. And you can see that the frost risk has increased significantly. We're getting colder frosts later in the year. And those are the killer frosts. They're the ones that kill your crop, that knock out your grapevines and your fruit trees. And so it's not just that the hot end of the spectrum is getting worse, but also the cold end of the spectrum is getting worse in some areas. So in spite of the fact that the temperature on average has warmed, what we're seeing is those cold extremes are cutting in more and more in some circumstances. And that is particularly due to climate change. So there's two main things that are happening. One is that the air tends to be drier under climate change, as I'll show you in the next slide. And that means you get more radiation loss. And we also have trends to lower rainfall in southern Australia, which means we have less cloud cover, and that means more radiation loss from the Earth out to space. And so that gives you more frosty conditions. But also that climate change is making the high pressure systems that used to sit across the middle of Australia, they're moving further south, and they're getting bigger and stronger. And that actually means that those are now bringing in sort of sub-Antarctic air in across southern Australia from well below Tasmania. So we're getting super cool air coming in off the ocean, Southern Ocean, and that works with those other two factors to give us extreme frost conditions late in the year. So we've got different drivers which are accumulating to cause these different types of extreme changes, but all linked back to climate change. And as I mentioned, the air across the world is actually tending to get drier. So it's what we call the vapor pressure deficit, or VPD. And that's also the case in Australia. So the vapor pressure deficit is essentially the difference between the amount of moisture that the air can hold at a given temperature versus what it does hold. And so that's what we call the vapor pressure gradient. And the drier it is, the harder the air sucks on things like plants. And so it makes your plants less water use efficient. So you produce less growth per unit rainfall. And that's going up already, and it's projected to increase dramatically over the next 100 years or so. So that dryness of the air, which drives things like evaporation and pushes down on water use efficiency, is getting worse. And we obviously see rainfall decreasing in parts of Australia, so southwest and southeast Australia, but increasing in the northwest, and again driven by climate change. So this is the Southern Australia winter rainfall record from the Bureau of Meteorology, and you can see that there's a long-term trend downwards, lots of variability, but a long-term trend downwards, and essentially there's about a 20% reduction in the last 100 years in terms of winter rainfall. Now that plus the change in the vapor pressure deficit, which is the dryness of the air, are driving up evaporation rates. And we've seen that temperature increase, the vapor pressure deficit increase, and less rainfall. And so unsurprisingly, we're seeing droughts happening more frequently and to a greater extent and more quickly across Australia, as is happening across the rest of the world. And I'll show you, unfortunately, what the projections are for this out into the future, and they're pretty scary. So If we sort of combine all of those factors together, it's not surprising we're already seeing climate change have impacts in terms of productivity and profitability across Australia. So this is a study that came from ABARES, sitting in Department of Agriculture in Canberra, and what they used was agricultural statistics, and what they took out was the technology signal, the improvements in management and varieties and things like that, and so that they were left with the climate signal in terms of impacts on profitability in this case. And what they found was across broadacre agriculture in Australia, climate change has already driven down profitability by an average of 22%, but in some places that's gone up, in the northwest where rainfall has increased, but in other places has gone down even more than that 22%. And so we can see some averages down the bottom right-hand corner. So Victoria lost about a third in terms of profitability from climate change alone, and in the last, since the year 2000. So very, very significant impacts that are happening already. So we don't have to wait till 2050, it's already here with us. So then the next part of the talk is what might happen in the future. So these are scenarios of future emissions building off what we've seen in terms of past greenhouse gases. So the past greenhouse gases on your left-hand side, the black line, and the coloured lines are possible future emissions out into the future. Our current trajectory, the one we're on at the moment, notwithstanding COVID, would take us to a world 3, 4, 5, or even 6 degrees hotter than the long-term average. So that's like an ice age degree of change, but in the other direction. If all countries did what they said under the Paris Agreement, we'd be heading to a world around about 3 degrees warmer than the long-term average. Unfortunately, many countries aren't doing what they said they'd do under the Paris Agreement. So we're overshooting that very considerably. We're on the red line, not on the other line. If we want to actually meet the Paris Agreement targets, which are keeping temperatures well below 2 degrees, or if possible to 1.5, we've got to go onto the blue line or the dashed line. And you can see that the change from where we have been going in terms of increasing greenhouse emissions to where we need to go to meet those targets is dramatic. And so that isn't necessarily bad because it depends on what you do and how you do it. So for some industries, this would be quite terrifying. For others, it would be a great opportunity. So for example, if you're a wind turbine manufacturer or a solar panel manufacturer or an electric vehicle manufacturer, you'd actually be saying this is a great opportunity. So there's no rights and wrongs here. There's no goods or bads. It depends on your context. And so there's no absolutes here. But what this does say is that if we are to manage temperature change, we actually have to do things very, very differently across the globe, and that includes in agriculture. So what might 3 degrees or so mean in terms of, say, heat stress? So heat stress is a combination of temperature and humidity, and high levels of temperature and humidity mean that our bodies or the bodies of livestock can't actually get rid of the metabolic heat that they produce. And so as a consequence, if you're a high production livestock animal like a dairy cow, what you do is you reduce your intake, and that reduces productivity, simply to manage the heat load in the body. If we look at the top left-hand panel, that's the heat stress historically felt across Australia. And you can see, say, the top end had about 70% heat stress days, the southeast and southwest about 10% or less. Under a 3 degrees scenario, you can see that virtually the whole of the top end becomes a heat stress day every day. The top third of Australia has heat stress similar to what's historically experienced by the top end around Darwin. And those sorts of conditions experienced in central Queensland now intrude right across southern Australia. And so what sounds like a small number in terms of temperature change results in major, major changes in terms of heat stress frequency. If you look in terms of water availability, this is a very recent study with a mid-range emission scenario. And what that shows is that Australia will be one of the most heavily hit places across the globe in terms of reductions in water storage across our landscapes, particularly the southeast and southwest, where a lot of our agriculture occurs. And you can look at those dark colours and they map almost identically across our major farming zones. Of course, we're not the only place that gets affected like this, and South American parts of South America are more heavily affected than us. But what this means is that there will be a really significant impacts more broadly across our agricultural system. It's not just about what happens in situ, but it's what might go on in terms of our trade, and I'll cover that in the next slide. But it's not just that our water systems may suffer, but the system characteristics may change. So in southern Australia, we're going to have proportionately more summer rain. The rain that does fall will have a higher intensity, so it'll fall with sort of greater dumps of rainfall, so more thunderstorm type rainfall than frontal rainfall. Likely increased season to season variability, so those sort of ENSO swings between the dry and the wet are likely to increase. So the dries get drier and the wet get wetter. And as I said before, increased vapor pressure deficit, so the dryness of the air. If we look at drought projections across the globe, we can see that Australia is one of the drought hotspots across the globe, partly as a result of those changes in water availability, akin to what happens across the Mediterranean, North Africa, and parts of South America. And what this means when we think about in terms of agriculture is that food prices on average are likely to increase. So many of these affected areas are major food producing areas. So that means food trade is likely to increase due to variability in supply. So we'll be shipping more food around the place as from year to year, just simply to smooth out supplies. And what this says to me is that there will be a competitive advantage to those countries and those industries that adapt best to these changing conditions. Everyone will be affected, more or less, some positively, some negatively, but it's the ones who adapt best are the ones who are best placed. If we look at what might happen, and we will need to adapt significantly, if we look at what might happen in terms of drought locally in Australia, this is a recent study from CSIRO looking at extreme droughts and frequency. And you can see that for every region in Australia, the different coloured bars are different regions, the frequency of extreme drought and the percentage of time in drought will go up as we approach the end of the century. And in fact, in the worst scenarios, it becomes commonplace, what used to be thought of as extreme drought. That's really concerning from my perspective. So of course, we'll all have to adapt. And so there's a whole stack of agronomic approaches through to strategic approaches in terms of adaptation. And when we work with farmers over many years going through an adaptation journey, you know, how will you adapt to climate change? They usually start with the agronomic and technical, but they end up noting that it's actually the strategic decisions which are the critical ones in terms of making adapting to climate change. So it's thinking strategically about this issue, which is the really important thing. And in terms, this is my last slide, Margo. So in terms of the what this might mean in terms of emission reductions, I think there's some significant implications here. So firstly is that when we look at agriculture, it emits around about 21% of greenhouse gases, more sort of essentially directly through activities on farm and pre-farm and post-farm. But across the value chain, across the food system, it's around about 29% with some variability around that. So almost a third of greenhouse gas emissions globally are associated with food. So it's far, far too big to ignore from a policymaker's point of view. If we look at our Australian numbers, they're a bit below this, but we haven't actually done a really good addition of all of those components to get the same numbers for Australia. If we actually look at what agriculture can contribute to reducing emissions, there's several different sort of layers of this. Firstly, we can reduce those emissions of methane from livestock and other sources. We can reduce emissions of nitrous oxide by being better fertiliser managers, and also from land management in terms of reductions in land clearing, which have already happened. We can increase our biomass carbon and soil carbon stores through increased management. And there's a lot of discussion happening at the moment on this, some of which in my view is over-optimistic, but nevertheless, it's actually really important to include in terms of people's thinking about management. And we can also displace fossil fuel use by producing energy on farm, so that we can, by having solar PV, solar panels or wind turbines on our farms, which actually produce energy that actually can displace the use of fossil fuel energy like coal-fired power stations elsewhere. So farms can contribute by being energy producers, and similarly through bioenergy. The last point I want to make is that unfortunately, climate change is going to make almost all of those things above harder. They're going to reduce feed quality, which pushes up methane emissions. They're going to push down on soil carbon. So soil carbon reduces with reduced rainfall and higher temperatures. So we're pushing against headwinds of climate change to increase our soil carbon. It'll reduce biomass growth rates. So our trees will grow more slowly and to a shorter stature under increased temperature and more drought conditions. It's going to increase biomass loss factors from fire. So more frequent and more severe fires, which we're already seeing, are likely to burn down our carbon stores. And drought can kill trees, etc. So there's a whole range of loss factors which are all going to be made worse by climate change. And so the key message here is that it's not just we have to adapt our fundamental part of agriculture, the productive part of agriculture, but if we're thinking about greenhouse gas emission reduction, we also have to adapt to climate change in terms of those activities as well. So the key summary here is that climate change is happening, more change is likely to happen ahead of us, and we need to adapt both in terms of our production systems and in terms of how we reduce emissions from agriculture. Thank you.
Brilliant, and thanks, Mark. And I mean, as everyone can see, it's a very complex issue, and there's been a lot of work, but we all have a role to play. And I guess, Mark, we'll have to put on your radar some pig power. So we have 26% of our farms generating their own power. So suddenly a whole new dimension to the pig industry. So thank you so much. And just a reminder, people do have the opportunity to ask questions at the end of this, but we will continue moving through our speakers now. So thank you, Mark. It does give me great pleasure to introduce Joanna Granger. So Joanna's actually joining us from Brussels today. So thank you so much for making time for us. For those who don't know, Joanna is the Australian Government's Minister Counsel for Agriculture at the Australian Mission to the EU and NATO, working on agriculture, trade and market access. So prior to taking up the trade role, Jo actually worked here in Australia heavily on agriculture policy for a wide range of commodities, so including grains, cotton, dairy, wool, horticulture and wine. Jo's also led the work to establish the Dairy Code of Conduct and works on increasing access to migrant labour in the sector. So she's had a huge contribution to Australia and now joining us from Brussels. So welcome, Jo.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. It's lovely to join the panel. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, here we go. So I'm one of 22 ag councillors posted around the world, and we're focused on ag trade. We gather market intelligence. We deal bilaterally with our host governments and obviously contribute to multilateral fora. Here in Brussels, I've got a colleague, Kieran McDonald, so 2 Australian-based officers here from the Brussels office, and we cover about 40 markets, so the EU 27 and the broader Europe. So it's fair to say that sustainability and our Australian agricultural sustainability credentials are the #1 issue for us here in Europe. But I think increasingly, I think our first presentation today tells us why increasingly our sustainability credentials are going to be important for all of our ag trade markets. I'm sure many of you have seen the recent ABARES Megatrends report, the update to it, and it tells us we've got a rising middle class. They're empowered. They're going to have rising expectations for health, provenance, sustainability and ethics. The EU, as you guys well know, is a high value market. It's got a large middle class, and it is the epitome of choosy customers who expect that sustainability, ethics, quality, high standards is part of what they want to purchase. And I think really the EU market's a good bellwether for where our customers of the future will be expecting to go. All right, why will my screen not move? There we go. So the European Green Deal. So Europe has heard the message about climate change, and it wants to be climate neutral by 2050. It's got a very big, ambitious commitment. It wants to completely disconnect economic growth from resource use. It is the central policy goal for the Ursula von der Leyen Commission. All the policies and commitments have to lead back to that, and that's across the board. So they've got an action plan which has got a raft of measures. They've got a lot of money. They're going to invest in in finance incentives, in R&D, and they've also got €100 billion just transition fund, which effectively is going to pay the losers as member states and communities make some of the trade-offs. The big one for agriculture is the farm to fork strategy. And so this is where the rubber hits the road for the agriculture sector for the EU in terms of how they will adapt and effectively move to a sustainable future. So, they've got very ambitious targets on reducing pesticide use and risk by 50%. They want to reduce the sale of antibiotics on the market by 50%, reduce nutrient use by 20%. They currently have about 8% of their ag land under organics. They want to go to 25% by 2030. A range of new labelling requirements are coming for all agri-food that'll be directly at retail sales. So sustainability labelling, nutrition labelling, animal welfare labelling. The big focus on healthy food and incentivising consumers to make the healthy choice, which in large part is a code for plant-based diets. They want to reduce food loss and waste, both in the home and across the supply chain. They're very interested in phasing out things like single-use plastics, really making every element of the food supply and the food system sustainable. There's a very strong push on deforestation. That seems to be a lightning rod issue here in the EU. They're going to require, or they already require, due diligence on businesses, and they're going to increase that so that they really reduce the risk that product that has caused deforestation or been produced on deforested land ends up on the EU market. They've got two major reviews currently happening on animal welfare. So they're reviewing the whole animal welfare framework, but they've also got a parliamentary inquiry into live animal exports as well as land transport standards. Now, we have a lot of parliamentary inquiries here. That's very part of our system, but there's quite a big deal in the EU. This is only the third ever parliamentary inquiry. So that gives you a sense of how high status and how much attention it's getting. And of course, in addition to all the measures under the farm to fork, they've got their usual internal decision making. And so lots of big things for agriculture coming up in the works. So right now, the technical conversation has already started on whether or not glyphosate will continue to be allowed to be used in the EU. Its authorization runs out in 2022. The science work has already started, and next year will be a huge political conversation here. Because obviously in the EU system, they've got a science-based system, but they also have a political overlay in terms of the decision-making on chemical use. The other one that they're doing is, in fact, next month, the European Food and Safety Authority will release a report in relation to new plant breeding techniques and things like CRISPR. And I'm sure many of you are aware just how toxic the GMO discussion is in the EU. So very hopefully the decision will be that CRISPR is not considered a GMO and doesn't get captured by some of the huge restrictions there. So where are we at with farm to fork? This is a very big agenda, and it was released with great fanfare and huge support from civil society in May last year. At that time, the environmental stakeholders were very much in the ascendancy, and there was a lot of expectation about the ambition and great support, and a lot of the civil society groups were incredibly happy about this project. Agriculture stakeholders and member states, though, in the conversation are pushing back pretty strongly. And in the EU system, it's a little bit similar to ours. So they have a split responsibility. So the European Commission has authority to do certain things, member states do others. And where the European Commission has authority, it can't get its own way automatically. It has to have a three-way conversation. It proposes legislation, it puts it to the EU Parliament, and it also has to agree it with the EU Council, which is effectively the member states group. So there's always a three-way conversation to get anything done. It means that, of course, the vision is very ambitious, but that three-way conversation tends to pare things back. It also means that none of this is happening quickly. Even when they came out with the strategy, they planned that it would take until 2023 for all the legislation to go into the Parliament. So a number of these measures won't be in place until 2023, 2024. And also it remains unclear just whether these targets will be aspirational and how many of them might end up in legislation as a firm target. Of course, the EU has the Common Agriculture Policy, which is effectively a huge bucket of money. almost a third of their budget goes to the agriculture sector in terms of the subsidies and supports they offer. Then, of course, they plan to use that money to incentivise change in behaviour, incentivise farmers taking up a lot of these measures. And so that's still a point of discussion. The cap has not been landed either. So there's still a lot of decision making to go in this area. What we do know that wherever it lands, the EU will look to impose the same restriction on trading partners in the name of levelling the playing field and making sure that they don't get competition from lower standard countries. And of course, they'll do that through the SPS arrangements, the health certificate requirements, import tolerances on pesticides, and of course, their influence in international standing setting bodies. So for instance, one of their proposals under Farm to Fork is that where the EU has banned a chemical for a range of matters, it will make a decision about the import tolerance. It will make a decision about the environmental impact of the use of that chemical in the third country, like Australia, as part of its decision-making in setting the import tolerance. Understandably, that's got us and a number of our trading partners like the US and Canada pretty interested, also our Latin American colleagues very interested in the decision-making framework. It's fair to say that a big part of the EU's values agenda is about promoting the global transition, not just in agriculture, but across the board as they encourage all countries around the world to get on board and make the change to carbon neutral by 2050. The other policy to talk quickly about is the Biodiversity Strategy. It was released on the same day as Farm to Fork. It dovetails the Farm to Fork targets are reflected in the Biodiversity Strategy. They've got, they're going to unlock about $20 billion in R&D funding, both public and private, to support a range of these. This one has not been as controversial. The focus has been absolutely the Farm to Fork. Australia compares very well with a lot of the biodiversity targets we already have. Our marine parks, so we already protect over 30% of our sea area. We've got incredibly strong sustainable fisheries management. We obviously have a very strong biosecurity regime that's protecting our unique environment and biodiversity. So we've got a lot of very positive stories to tell in this area. But as I said, the focus in the EU discussion is not very much about biodiversity at the moment. And of course, a Green Deal, it's got a lot of policy levers. And there's a couple other ones, and more will come out. But two I just wanted to highlight, and I know there's been a lot of conversation and focus in Australia on the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And obviously John will talk a lot more about carbon markets in a minute. But just to really give you a snapshot very quickly, nothing is decided yet. So the EU has done some consultation on 4 different options, but they haven't actually put the option they're planning to take forward on the table. We don't expect to see that until mid this year. So we really still don't know quite what the design and the industries will be. It's pretty clear that agriculture won't be covered in the initial design. So it isn't an immediate thing for our industry. And even then, they aren't planning for the carbon border adjustment mechanism to even come into effect until the 1st of January 2023. One of the proposals they had was to extend their existing emission trading scheme. Now, the emissions trading scheme obviously targets the very highest risk carbon leakage sectors like steel and cement, electricity, aluminium, but it does have paper and it does have fertilizer production. So if they did choose all of those sectors for coverage, then our forestry sector and obviously agriculture, to the extent that we are sourcing fertilizer from Europe, or the trade impact, there could be an initial trade impact. I think on the whole, though, that once the CBAM is in place and over time, it will be very hard for it not to be expanded to include both the transport sector and the agriculture sector, 2 very large carbon footprint sectors, and probably more broadly across the economy. So it's certainly not a now thing, but I think in the future we should expect it will be. So my best guess is the next 3 to 5 years, agriculture won't be covered. Within the 5-year window, though, the conversation will start to extend to when ag should come in, particularly as they get closer to 2030 and they look back at the targets that they're hoping to meet. The other one is the 2020 Circular Economy Action Plan. This is a focus in the EU. It plays well with their Green Deal. We've got a lot of activity in Australia as well on circular economy activity. Reducing waste, improving lifespan of product and the like. But one element is the product environmental footprint. It's actually been going for quite a long time. And I know that Dr. Stephen Wiedemann, who of course is our Australian expert, is going to have a deep dive on this topic tomorrow afternoon. But the PEF effectively is a labelling scheme that helps consumers understand green claims on products, helps them compare those green claims, and ideally means those claims are backed by some evidence, they're trustworthy. At this stage, we expect to see a legislative proposal by mid-2021 from the Commission. They did 2 rounds of consultation last year. Again, it's unclear if the labelling requirement will be mandatory or voluntary. There's a lot. The PEF is an incredibly complex methodology and framework. It's going to add costs for business. It's a bit difficult to comply with, and it's not even done. So there's a lot of reasons why there will be strong views in the Council from the Member States and from people in the Parliament to probably look to pare it back to voluntary as opposed to a mandatory scheme, but we'll just have to see how those play out. So what does all this mean for us and how we as Australian Ag are participating in the EU? Well, as you well know, Australia's got some very strong Australian agriculture sustainability story to tell, which is great. And so one of our key priorities in the market is actually to let people know about that, to really raise our profile and talk about our sustainability bona fides. It's really important in terms of helping us influence the EU settings, but also for our FTA advocacy in this market, because ultimately the EU is a very high value market, and when we get an FTA, there will be increased opportunities for farmers to access that market. So we're doing a lot of engagement across the board, as you would expect, with the EU Parliament, the Commission and the Council. We're talking with the Member States, with industry and civil society. We've recently held 2 sustainable agriculture webinars where we had Australian farmers and EU farmers and policymakers talking about what we do in Australia, our bona fides, our credentials, the shared challenges, our like-minded perspective on sustainability. And we also had Assistant Minister Dunniam participated this year on a climate resilient agriculture panel with the EU Ag Commissioner Wojciechowski, and that was in January. So that's the Global Forum on Food and Agriculture. I know a number of you would be aware of it. It's effectively the big agricultural ministers meeting in the EU, and they claim it's the largest ag ministers meeting in the world outside of a multilateral forum. So it gets quite a good profile. We've got a social media strategy. We're talking about our sustainability story every day, every conversation. That's our key talking point. We've been working with a number of RDCs and industry rep bodies. I know probably a number of you on the call today, really looking to get together fact sheets, which are sort of just 1 to 2 pages, very clear and crisp information to help decision makers here understand our story. And we're really keen to continue to do that. Please do share with us your case studies, your stories, your data. I think that for the EU market, but equally for all of our influencing, we can have the headline, but we need to have the data underneath it. And so the industry sustainability frameworks that industry is leading, the kind of science we're doing, the research and development investment we're doing, all of that stacks up really well, and we just need to package it up and present it really clearly for our customers. It's, I think coming back to it, it's really important that we keep talking about sustainability credentials. We see it as sustainability has arrived in terms of the topic here in the EU. It's had its day, and it's now the only topic. We're not the only country by any means talking about sustainability credentials. Everywhere you turn, you could dial into 10 ag sustainability webinars every week here, whether they're hosted by our competitors like Brazil or Argentina or US and Canada, or locally here. I think the other thing to think about is that COVID has really sparked a much stronger buy local conversation here. And of course, buy local is a thing that we have in Australia. It's sort of in all markets at different times. But I guess the question about agricultural supply chains has really pushed the buy local, and it also strengthens people's hands in sort of saying, well, we don't want imported product, transported product. It's got such a big greenhouse gas impact. We should just buy local. So we are really keen to continue to talk about our credentials, why a well-grown and sustainably produced product from Australia can actually be the better carbon choice, the better and more sustainable choice for EU consumers. But equally, that's going to be a message we'll need to send to our consumers all around the world. The final thing to tell you today is about the UN Food Systems Summit. So I'm sure a number of you are already tracking this. It's going to be a meeting in September this year attached to the UN General Assembly. There's a pre-meeting of agriculture ministers in July. Minister Littleproud will be participating. Basically, the EU has set out very early on that the Food Systems Summit is where they want to get support and build a coalition for their model of sustainability. And so we're participating as a country, but our focus is on Action Track 3, boosting nature positive production. We're really keen that people on this call are participating. Well, there'll be dialogues held by the department in May and June this year. If your organisation wants to host an event or, rebadge or, add a badge to an existing event that can contribute to the Food Systems Summit, I mean, it's one of those things that people say, oh, this is going to be a big government meeting. What's it actually going to achieve? The purpose is to try and refocus the world's attention on actually delivering on the last decade of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And the big one, of course, is reducing hunger and improving or reducing the impact of agricultural production on the environment. So pretty lofty goals. Our key message in this market is absolutely that Australia is on board. We are 100% signed up to global sustainable agriculture, but we don't think there's only one way to do that. The EU model may work for them. I think it's got a range of internal contradictions in the farm to fork strategy. Some of their approaches to technology and innovation will actually limit their productivity and their ability to adapt. That's quite a challenge for them. And we want to make sure that all the tools and all the opportunity for innovation remain on available for us in Australia, but also more broadly, because clearly from our earlier presentation, it's obvious that there's a lot of work and adaptation that's going to need to be done, and innovation will be really important. So having tools in the toolbox for that is important. Anyway, that's it for me for now, and happy to answer your questions.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jo. And I think there was a very clear message there that we've got a wonderful advocate sitting at a table in the EU, but we need to step up and get some information and be part of the conversation. And there's wonderful opportunities to do that. So thank you, Jo. So we're going to keep moving in. Just a gentle reminder, there is time for questions, and there is the question box there. So please feel free to put your questions through there. All right, so our next guest is known to many of us. So David Johanke is the Vice President of the National Farmers Federation, but he's also a third generation grain and livestock farmer. And what some may not know is David's actually going down a very strong course of renewable energy via wind farms from far northwest Victoria. So David's a voice at that table for NFF for us. So the NFF was established to represent the interests of agriculture across Australia and across the length and breadth of the supply chain. Today, David will be articulating agriculture's position on climate change in Australia, the opportunities for farmers, and what the sector needs to get there. So welcome, David.
Thanks, Margo, and I'll just share my screen. Right, there we go. So once again, thank you for the introduction. Yeah, I farm in a place called Burrawarra, actually on the west side of Victoria. And following on from Mark's presentation, the dryland cropping that we do through our district has seen a lot more heat shock and a lot more frost shock than previous generations. So our adaptation and farming systems changed radically over my farming career, let alone looking at different ways to innovate. And as a part of that, we do host renewable energies on our property, and we are looking to, in our region, to be able to do that further. But some of the main things out of this presentation I really want to dwell on, once again, is that productivity, sustainability, and the biodiversity on our Australian farms are really some of the key driving aspects of not only our policies from the aspect of National Farmers Federation, but they are actually at the heart of what we do in Australian agriculture as a whole, and we've been doing it for many years by default. And as Margo mentioned, we are a federation of many different industries, of many different production systems, and our policies are born through a committee system that actually develops up a good understanding of both what our farmers and our industries need and have been working within the different frameworks. So when we speak on this topic, we speak on it as a collective of a lot of agricultural production within Australia, and also the fact that the frameworks that we utilise and the policies that we use have been developed in conjunction with those industries, but then also the relevant government agencies as well. So I'm hoping that most people have heard about our $100 billion roadmap. And this is to try to increase the value of agricultural productivity out of Australia, essentially over the next decade and a half. And what we've done since launching it is divided our efforts into 5 main pillars, noting that if we were to do nothing, and the way agriculture currently sits, we sit around about $61 billion worth of production. And if we did nothing, we'd get to 2030 and our forecasted value would be around that $84 billion. So we've got a gap there that we need to fill, and that gap has to include a lot of effort by industry and a lot of effort by farmers to get there. And one of the key sectors, or one of the key parts of the 5 main pillars, and I really want to dwell on today, is the growing sustainably, which means that there's aspects of this pillar that relate directly to our climate change policy, but also looks at how we as agricultural producers can ensure that we are keeping in that top tier, that top level of innovation and of adaptation, using R&D being the key drivers from within Australia, but then also globally, how are we fitting into that our marketplace and also the different techniques that we use. So out of those 5 main elements under growing sustainably, being acknowledged for what we do is land stewardship is a key aspect of that. So I'll touch on that a bit more later. And then also our trending towards net zero, noting that by 2030, in our policy, we want to make sure that our trajectory is there. We won't necessarily be hitting carbon neutrality in that time space, but we'll definitely be working towards the different frameworks, the different processes to get there. Obviously, water is very topical, and that goes hand in glove with, once again, what Mark's presentation was, the availability of water, the actual rainfall events that we see, and how we change our farming systems to adapt to that, to utilise water, noting that we're having to do more with less continually. How can we make sure that our research is front of mind and ensuring that we're encompassing that? But then also not reducing our actual productivity, our landscape footprint, but enhancing that footprint, making sure that we are valuing it, making sure we are looking after it. And then obviously the last aspects being a bit more social about food waste, and noting that there's a lot of food at the moment that is lost within the chain itself, but then also at the consumer end. And for us to actually value, and not just price food, but actually value food, the amount of work that's gone into producing it, but then also when it gets to the consumer end, that they treat it with respect, and that we do get that full pull through of what farmers and agriculture actually do provide. So breaking down that just a little bit more, we do totally, well, at NFF, we're completely committed to playing our part as far as agriculture goes into the sustainability and meeting our targets as a collective. And we've seen that currently through debates both at the political spectrum, but then also through our own members themselves of farmers, noting that they are exposed to this industry, that they are exposed to climate change itself, and what can we do to play a part. But there's 2 main caveats we do have this discussion, and that is that we want to make sure that there's an economic pathway identified, and we'll go into that a bit further later when we talk about the different aspects of the framework that we're putting together, but then also that farmers aren't disadvantaged. And I guess that really does tie in neatly with presentation we've just seen with Joe, that we know that there's a lot of policy being developed, not only externally, internationally, but then also internally, that we don't want to see farmers having to bear the brunt of a lot of the environmental work, noting that we work around about 51% Australia's landmass is underneath farmer stewardship. We want to make sure that we're not disadvantaged by having caveats put on us when we're actually the ones actually driving or looking after that landmass. So we want to make sure it's, as we go into this, a more carrot than stick approach. We want to make sure that the legislation is about encouraging and rewarding more than locking up and trying to make sure that farmers are doing their part via either legislation, pure legislation, or penalties. So noting to get all this up and running, we need to understand where we currently sit. We need to understand what's happening out in agriculture. We have to be able to measure it, because as the old adage is, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And it's something that we're very passionate about, understanding not only where we currently sit within the different systems, but then also being able to give definitive numbers on how we trend, how we operate, and then ultimately, if we are looking at an economic driver, how we are rewarded for the good stewardship that is done. So noting that in late last year, even with the aspects of COVID, we had a update on not only our climate change policy within NFF, but then also how that incorporated itself into our 2030 roadmap. And when we talk about agricultural production and we talk about trending towards carbon neutrality, we want to make sure that we are still offering the range of products that we have always done. We don't want this to be hijacked by either a plant-based discussion or neglecting the fact that red meat is a key sector that we do export out of Australia. We want to make sure that people can still have that choice, but we're doing it in a sustainable way. And also noting from Joe's presentation that we can't do this alone. Australia may be an island, but we are connected both internationally and through our exposure to climate change, but then also we are an exporting nation, noting that 75% of our exports do reach consumers that are becoming more aware and more astute to production systems, and then also wanting to understand more about not only our current production systems, but also our future intent of what we're trying to achieve. So by seeing not only our consumers changing their appetite, but also seeing that investors are also changing their commitment towards lower emission technologies and lower emission goods and services, Australia needs to make sure that we're part of this discussion. And that's why we are looking and working with our commodities to develop pathways to help trajectory of each industry to that net zero position, while maintaining our profitability and productivity. And that's the real challenge for us in a nation that not only is a large landmass, that is relatively extensive and intensive in many, many aspects because of the climate that we work within, but also the fact that we don't get a lot of government support. We don't have a lot of baseline input from government financially, and a lot of the goodwill that's currently being done is by farmers understanding that sustainability and that biodiversity is key drivers of their systems. And what we do seek out of this discussion is that we need to, with our two very strict caveats of making sure that we're not disadvantaged and there is economic drivers for us to do this, we want to make sure that when we are talking about a trending towards net zero carbon emissions, that R&D needs to be both dedicated to our individual production systems, but then also as a whole, how we get rewarded for adopting those systems and actually taking on board a lot of the change that needs to occur. And I think Mark probably did a very good job just in that very brief description of how agriculture has adapted to date. But adaptation itself doesn't solve the climate change conundrum. We do need to also acknowledge that whatever we do incorporate, whenever we are changing our systems, so if we can reduce our waste, reduce our inputs to make sure that we're more targeted, that has a net effect globally on the amount of carbon that is released through our different systems. So there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of investment to go to get that R&D to a stage, not only where we can fully understand our individual systems and then also then apply it down to the farmer level, to my level, to make sure that I'm getting access to the best technology, but then also fully understanding what my system is. So we break it down to some different pathways, and this is a very broad framework, and this is a very, very important way of how we want to make sure that we are addressing the aspects of carbon and understanding carbon in the farming systems. We need to have that climate initiative. We need to make sure that we are getting the baseline information, that we are understanding our current risks and our current ways that we are being very resilient and adapting to the current situation. We need to make sure that programs such as what's being developed through the Australian Agricultural Innovation Australia that's focusing on the long-term impact of not only their farming systems, but then also how we're incorporating the climate, how we're incorporating carbon into those systems, that we are getting acknowledged for that. And I guess it really comes down to when we're looking at the next quadrant, the CRSPI, the section of how are we ensuring that there's some common language, some common accounting that's being utilised. Because ultimately, when we have this discussion, what I hear and what I do may be completely different to what researchers are currently trying to explain, are currently trying to adapt. And we need to get that marriage between the producer, the farmer, and then also that science. And being a person who believes in science, being a person that is absolutely dedicated to understanding how we can improve our systems, that is absolutely critical and will underpin the actual adaptation, that trust that we need in these systems, and in an environment now where we get challenged all the time, not only from people who are at the opposite end of the spectrum, but then also people who want us to go further, and how we can get that middle ground, how we can make sure that we are getting the best out of our system, making sure we're getting our best out of our farming is really critical. And when you look at programs such as CN 2030, it is about being ambitious. And agriculture is up for that challenge. And there's no doubt about that. Some of the areas that we work in will be quite difficult. Others may be a little bit more malleable to get to these targets. But when we look at, say, the CN 2030, there's some key areas around that: leadership, development, and that's that personal resilience, understanding what we're trying to target and how will we get a voice in this sometimes very crowded marketplace. Making sure that when we do talk about carbon, that it's not purely about burps and farts. It's about making sure that we're looking at the whole system and how can we actually make it a better place, not only through perennial pastures, through our soils, through carbon storage, but the whole system itself. And one of the key things for us, and that last quadrant, is about the political will. Making sure that when we talk to our politicians, when we talk to our relevant ministers, that they are developing a clear structure and clear language as well. And we've seen that commitment already, but we need that commitment to also be financial as far as that R&D segment, but then also making sure that it is a market-driven system, not a legislative system that will be more of that stick. We are definitely focused on carrot, and we are definitely focused on being a part of the bigger solution and hopefully helping other industries. So when we then move into discussions such as carbon itself, we also have seen agriculture, obviously, once again, being one of the largest land stewards, and farmers being the interface of that, being really critical to ensuring that we are forefront of any emissions reduction. And we have been very benefited a lot from the Emission Reductions Fund, which is about, since 2014, agriculture has received about 60% of that funding. But there's a lot more to be done, not just from the current status, the current availability of funds, but we've got to look at things like the King report that provide some clear pathways into addressing some of the key issues. For example, they've recommended that government help facilitate methods of stacking and tailing small-scale emission reduction funding schemes themselves. How can we make sure that we get those methods down to the smaller farms, not just the bigger ones that can take on larger projects that have got huge impact, but we need that to be available to all farm projections. We've got to make sure that the Clean Energy Regulator is reviewed to seek new methodologies to improve the carbon market itself. It includes soils and even, as Margo mentioned, some biomethane opportunities as well. We need government to prioritise soil carbon under its low emissions technology statement. And they've got a target to make sure that they improve the actual technologies that we're using to measure these soils to be more affordable as well, because with that once again, if we can measure what we're doing, it means a lot more about growing that knowledge base, but then also improving our systems themselves. And on our final note, one of the key things that the NFF has been involved with and is very passionate about is that natural capital. And in many ways, this is once again, the framework, the stewardship that we like to look through our lens of making sure that we are productive, we are sustainable, and we do protect biodiversity. And in December 2019, the NFF, along with KPMG, launched the Return on Nature, the fact that we wanted to have that discussion around farming systems, marketing options, and that ability to scale up any system that does reward farmers for their good work. So overall, I guess we're here talking about frameworks. We're here talking about developing research so that we can have a discussion at the farmer level. But for that to happen, we need investment into R&D to make sure that we are, and R&D that's targeting the ability for us to still remain competitively or financially viable, sustainable, and also ensuring that we are in a global marketplace, that we remain competitive, that we don't put legislative barriers in place that make our production systems less efficient, that make it more expensive for us to produce the food that we do, while still we need to keep forging that conversation with our consumers, still having that conversation domestically as well to ensure that we are both promoting what agriculture does do and the good work that we currently do, probably more behind the scenes than we ever have, and get acknowledgement for that, because we are seeing a lot of different movements, once again, that try to take the space and try to dictate to agriculture what we should or shouldn't be doing. But the reality is, it's farmers like myself that are at the forefront of all this discussion, and we're the ones that actually feel any ripples that do come through the system. So once again, from a national perspective, from the NFF perspective, we are about making sure that farmers are here to both do our job of producing the food, but then also are rewarded for the good works that we do. So Margo, I'd like to say thanks, and hopefully that gives a bit of perspective of what's happening nationally, but then also at the grassroots level as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, DJ. And it is really important that we have to have everybody involved. So whether you're grassroots, frontline, R&D, government, you name it, everyone needs to be involved. So, and fantastic to see the CRSPI common approach to GHG emissions projects getting up and going. All talking on the same language is a great place to start. Now, we are going to continue moving because I am conscious of people's time. So it does give me great pleasure to introduce our fourth and final speaker for today. So John Connor is the CEO of the Carbon Market Institute. So John has 25 years experience working on public and business policy with a focus on climate, sustainability and development issues. For those who don't know, the Institute speaks for business leading the transition to a net zero economy, sharing knowledge, building capacity and catalysing opportunities. They support the continued evolution of carbon markets and related policies, but they're also champions for the UNFCCC Paris Agreement. But John will be talking today on the global trends in the carbon markets and nature-based climate solutions. So welcome, John.
Thank you very much, Margo, and thanks for everyone else's excellent contributions. I'll just try and share my screen while we're getting going. And there we go. I think that's working. So yes, you introduced the Carbon Market Institute. We've got now around 100 members. It's everyone from producers like MacDoc Ag all the way through the carbon chain, financing with the four big banks, insurers, a whole range of service providers, through to the most emission intensive companies in the Australian economy, who are actively looking to decarbonise, but also engage carbon markets and as they meet both public policy and also consumer and investor requirements. Just to go back a bit to a slide that Mark showed a variant of before, the task at hand is extremely significant, and if we are to avoid the worst impacts that Mark highlighted, then we do need to get to net zero emissions, and there are significant benefits being separately mapped about keeping it to the most ambitious of the Paris Agreement goals of 1.5 degrees, keeping warming to no 1.5 degrees, although we're already appropriately described in a climate emergency or crisis at just over 1 degree. So the task is very significant. We need to avoid emissions and decarbonise, but as we do that, we're going to need to build negative emissions, and the reality is we're going to need significant negative emissions, net negative emissions through the end of the century. And so one of the aims of Carbon Market Institute is to build a carbon market of excellence in negative emissions technologies in Australia. That's biological, industrial and geological, but there are obviously significant opportunities there in the land-based sector. And just to give you an example of that in terms of how investors are looking at the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, which is a global umbrella group for global investors, have a policy process called the Inevitable Policy Response. And they did some estimates that the net zero technologies, the nature-based solutions element of that, could by 2050 be worth $800 billion in annual revenues, with a market capitalisation of over 1.2 trillion, and that's bigger than the oil and gas sector is right now. Vital to this, and I'll conclude with this later, is that we build this, can't build this on sand. We need to build a system of integrity and transparency. That's critical to that if Australia is to grab opportunities in that and play our role. Just to share that the carbon markets are growing. We're still too small really in terms of compliance. They cover around 20% of greenhouse gas emissions, but we are seeing them emerge in some of our key trading partners and others. So we saw earlier discussions around the EU system, which is one of the most advanced, but we're seeing systems emerge, national system emerging in China now as we speak. South Africa is actually moving into the purple there with a carbon price, a range of mechanisms around the world, and this will be accelerated if the carbon border adjustment mechanism is put in place to drive and actually make sure that other countries aren't free riders within that. We do in Australia have a compliance market. It's a pretty meagre element, frankly, though. It's under what's called the safeguard mechanism, but there are still some requirements. There's a requirement under that safeguard mechanism for some of our biggest polluters to manage and measure, and if they do breach some baselines, then they actually need to purchase in the marketplace some offsets. But the biggest part of that is the emissions reduction fund, which I'll come back to in a moment. This slide gives you a sense of the carbon prices being offered around the world in these markets as they tighten and move to the requirements that are necessary. You see on the right there, the European Union is at a very significant price now. They've been pretty wary about land-based offsets getting burned early on, but there was definitely some negotiations under the carbon pricing mechanism when it was under operation for a couple of years here in Australia about linking. So that's a sense of some of the pricing that might have been available, but we see in these other markets some significant prices which have links in Australia. The last auction price was just under $16, but we've got a spot market where some of that compliance purchases are taking place, where some of the voluntary markets, acquisitions where companies who are wanting to demonstrate carbon neutrality purchasing, and that's they're already a spread there. We'll have a the next auction in next month, so it'll be very interesting to see whether that comes closer to that spot price. That's been driving, in particular, I mean, David already mentioned that some 60% of that market, almost $2.5 billion being committed to date, goes into the agricultural sector, and we're seeing a more active land management coming into play with that. But with the higher prices, then a greater range of those methods can be put in place. We're certainly working as the Carbon Market Institute. We've got with those method priorities that the government's got on soil carbon and blue carbon, and there's plantations in that the current priority set, but we're also working as a priority to get the landscape, to get the method stacking that David mentioned before. We've got a task force with that, and there's a whole range of issues there where how we can expand that to the farmers at the producer level and at smaller scale. So indeed trying to work on that. Giving you the big picture here with there's a global voluntary market. This is again where we see in particular companies under pressure from investors and consumers making these commitments, and they've been growing and growing significantly even despite COVID. There's just recently been a task force out on scaling voluntary carbon markets, which shows that if it's this market alongside compliance markets is to deliver, then it's going to need to grow even some 15 times. And it's more than $50 billion worth of value by 2030. Just to give you a sense of some of these other marketplaces and Australia's role in that, at a nature-based levels, we're pretty significant there in terms of the proportion of the size of the market. So we've got the largest national run offset system when it comes to land-based solutions. There are private registries selling to these companies. So that's the American Carbon Registry, Vera, Climate Action Reserve Gold Standard. You can see there's a couple of provinces in Canada, and the CDM there is the Clean Development Mechanism under the old Kyoto mechanism, and that's got a lot of relatively cheap carbon units on offer, but that scale, that spread will decrease significantly once the Paris Agreement kicks in further. And all countries have obligations, and so that's why we are seeing very active participation in the carbon market and land-based solutions as part of that from some of our bigger emitters. And so we're seeing Shell actually purchase the carbon project developer here in Australia, Select Carbon, Woodside making long-term offtake agreements with Greening Australia and the like. So there's a substantial marketplace and activity already underway in Australia and predicted to grow. Just here to see that we are one of the biggest in the Asia Pacific region. We, as Carbon Market Institute, in 2017 developed a carbon farming industry roadmap. We've worked closely with state governments and the Commonwealth Government as they develop this marketplace. If we have some of the stronger policy drivers, we can see significant value even for carbon farming as part of our markets. It needs a stronger policy, needs stronger safeguard mechanism, for example. But that can indeed smash, David, your percentage there by 2030 of what you require from environmental services if we can deliver on that scale. I'll share a link to that shortly, that roadmap, and we're working with partners to continue to build on that. One of the things that we are working on, one of the key barriers for producers is the fact that we have some very old thinking in our financial institutions, and so some of our producers and project developers are finding problems when farmers are walking into their bank branches and dealing with some old-fashioned ideas and poor data and poor guidance from the property valuers and the bank branches. So what we are doing is working there to build up the systems. We're working on shortly to come out with some standardised contracts for farmers in this area, but also working, as I say, with the banks, with the property valuation industry around some guidance notes and other work there to make that an easier process for farmers wanting to engage in this marketplace. I've seen some data that there's incredible spread across between states within different banks about the time that's being taken for people as they're trying to deal with this, deal with these proposals. So it's a key barrier that we need to be dealing with. I mentioned the importance of integrity. You can say what you like about the ambition of Australia's policies on climate, but we actually have one of the world's leading systems of integrity and assurance in its policy architecture. So born out of the Carbon Farming Initiative when it started under the Gillard pricing mechanism and still being driven actively through the Emission Reduction Fund. So Australian carbon credit units are deemed as financial products and so are under ASIC, and you have to have a financial service license to deal with that. The methods are developed. There's an independent emission reduction assurance committee, legislated offset integrity principles, and a high degree of backing in there from government level. We are developing with our project developers and industry the world's first carbon industry code of conduct. That's been going for now 2.5 years and is moving to an operational stage where the signatories are subject to an independent review panel, audits and other processes, and that's a marker of excellence we hope will brand well for it within Australia but also internationally shortly. Just summing up, we also run a range of summits and conferences. We've got a forthcoming summit, hopefully in person, in June 24 to 5. We'll cover a whole range of these issues in the bigger picture as well.
Sharing there, we got there in the end. Thank you to our 4 panelists for really interesting presentations. Just a reminder, they will be available on the CRSPI website. If you want any follow-up or questions or want to engage with people, please send me an email on the CRSPI Secretariat address, which you will find on the CRSPI website. We're really keen to motivate and keep these conversations going. Please join us again at 12:30. We've got a fantastic session on agriculture and the low emissions economy, and we're hearing from the private sector. 3 really interesting presentations there from 3 companies, along with an overview and introduction from Richard Heath. So we'll see you all again in about an hour and a half, fully caffeinated and with your lunch. Thanks, everyone. See you soon. Bye. CRSPI online forum, which is talking about climate and emissions reduction in agriculture. This session is looking at agriculture in a low emissions economy, and we really wanted to take the perspective of the private sector on this. So we have 4 presentations for you. Richard Heath from AFI will make the first presentation and will then take over chairing the session for me. Just some housekeeping for anyone who wasn't in session 1. Katie McRobert, who you just saw from AFI, is providing the back-end support on Zoom. She'll appear every now and then, so please don't be alarmed by that. She's also helping us manage the chat and the Q&A function. We're very keen to have a really good discussion during this session, so please make use of the Q&A box, which you will see at the bottom of your screen in the menu bar for Zoom. As the presentations are going along, start posing your questions in there. Both the chair and the presenters will see those questions, and we will work our way through and respond to them as the session goes on. The more questions, of course, we have from you, the more interesting the session will be. Just to let you know that the presentations are being recorded, but the Q&A at the end won't be recorded. That's so we can put the presentations up on the CRSPI website in a week or so. So Richard, that's all I had to cover. I'm going to introduce Richard Heath to you now. He is the Executive Director of the Australian Farm Institute. The AFI was established to conduct research into public policy issues impacting on the Australian farm sector and to promote policy solutions that maximise the economic and social wellbeing of farmers. Prior to joining AFI, Richard was Associate Professor of Agronomy and Farm Management at the University of Sydney, and before that was involved in a large farming family business in the northwest of New South Wales. Welcome, Richard, and I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Anwen. So look, really happy to have the opportunity to have an introduction to this session and to help facilitate today. As Anwen said, the AFI is an independent ag policy organisation. We look at emerging and important policy issues, and so you can imagine we're doing a lot of work in this space at the moment around emissions reduction and sustainability more generally. I might just take the opportunity to talk very briefly about a major project that we're involved with at the moment, which is establishing the Australian Agriculture Sustainability Framework. It is a set of national sustainability standards that will be put together as basically an alignment exercise looking at the influences from frameworks globally and domestically, and trying to come up with a consistent set of standards across all of those that industry frameworks can reference in the way that they put their own frameworks together. And the point of that is to give a signal, a pathway towards consistency in the way that all the sectors talk about sustainability, so that we can build a national brand around sustainability. And, you know, we've heard already this morning how important that's going to be in the trade environment and the international environment in terms of demonstrating the sustainability credentials of Australian ag in a way that is consistent and aggregated. So that's really what this Australian Ag Sustainability Framework will be going along towards and helping with. So as Anwen said, I'm going to provide the opening introduction. Really all I'm going to do is do a pretty brief scene setting exercise. I'm not going to talk too long, and I'm going to hand over to the other three speakers who will get into things in a lot more depth. So look, CRSPI, the Climate Research Strategy for Primary Industries, but obviously primary industries exist within the broader economy. And the pressures for emissions reduction obviously exist in that broader economy just as much as they do for agriculture. So what are the impacts, the relevant influences that the rest of the economy will have on primary production and pre-farm gate agriculture? I'm personally of the opinion that many of those wider economic drivers will actually have far more consequence for disruption, and particularly the pace of change in agriculture, than agriculture-specific policy or R&D. At the AFI, we think of the 3 C's as we've come up with of sort of determining factors for emissions reduction, and those being commitments, consumers, and corporate risk. All 3 are really significant. All 3 are related to each other very much, but all 3 have slightly different impact pathways that may be experienced more or less directly by farm businesses, and have different signals towards R&D, towards policy, and towards strategy. So briefly, commitments such as Kyoto and Paris provide legislative frameworks and requirements for national action. They're expressed through a lot of different mechanisms. In Australia, the most obvious one is the Emissions Reduction Fund, and the accounting methodologies that come out of that fund, and other pathways that go towards our national accounts for emissions reduction to demonstrate how we are meeting those commitments in the global marketplace. The consumers market signal. Consumers provide both through their purchase decisions, but also really importantly, their political influence, really strong signals around emissions reduction. Many, and the way that that's expressed directly into agriculture, if you think of many of the industry sustainability frameworks that are either already developed or being developed, and you know, I talked about the project we're involved with, which is a national framework that will sit over the top of all of those. So those sustainability frameworks and the branding efforts, they're really designed to provide consumer confidence that sustainability objectives are being met. The third C, corporate risk, is a rapidly emerging, and I think possibly what will be the biggest driver for change in agriculture. Requirements, corporate risk is sort of defines these requirements for companies to mitigate their climate risk and demonstrate their sustainability credentials in order to maintain shareholder value, to meet corporate disclosure requirements, and just to remain relevant in that corporate environment. So today we've got three fantastic speakers who are going to talk to those sorts of signals and those broader economic signals and responses to those signals in the extended agricultural supply chain. And we've sort of tried to cover that supply chain from beginning to end in some ways. I'll do more detailed introductions to each of the speakers as we go through, but we've got Martin Wilder from the Pollination Group, who's going to talk about that finance and investment environment that's impacting across the economy, but specifically in terms of agriculture and how much the sorts of an impact that's having. We've got Jael Bajada from Syngenta is going to talk about the ag inputs supply chain. And then Trevor Lucas from CBH will talk about the ag outputs supply chain. So we're covering off on finance and investment, and then inputs and outputs in terms of those broader economic signals and how they're going to impact on pre-farm gate agriculture. So to start off, we've got Martin Wilder. Martin is the founding partner of Pollination Group. He has a background in economics and law. Martin was head of Baker & McKenzie's global climate law and finance practice for 20 years and has played a key role with Australia's clean energy finance institutions. Martin is focused on developing innovative policies, ideas and investments that enable economies to rapidly transition to net zero, while at the same time preserving our natural ecosystems. Pollination Group is a specialist climate change advisory and investment firm, accelerating the transition to a net zero, climate resilient future. Welcome, Martin, and I'll just remind everyone, please, as we're going through, if you've got any questions, put them in the Q&A at the bottom. We're going to have plenty of time at the end to cover off on those. Thanks, Martin.
Okay, thanks very much, Richard. So nice to be here, and thanks everybody for joining today. I think I was just going to touch a little bit on the role of agriculture in the transition to a net zero economy. And obviously, agriculture is one of the largest sources of emissions, but there's also significant opportunity in the agriculture sector. And I think to take a step back, one of the things that the Pollination Group did about 6 months ago was we established this joint venture with HSBC to try to work out a way in which we could value nature and actually get more investment into the sort of nature-based solutions area. I think, as people know, agriculture has been a strong and steady investment class for some time. There are obviously quite a lot of pension funds that are very interested in ag. There are others that are not. Also in Europe at the moment, we do see a bit of a split between those who are interested in sort of, cropping and those who do not want to invest in livestock. And so there is that split in the investment field as well. But I think traditionally agriculture has been seen by many as a more challenging asset class, although it's also seen very much as an asset class which can help diversify portfolio investments. So one of the things that we've been working quite hard on and looking at, and this sort of ties in with what the Australian government's doing around soil carbon, is looking at how do you enhance the value of agriculture, forestry, fisheries in a more sustainable way and get added value out of doing sort of more regenerative agriculture or more sustainable forestry. So in the platform that we've set up with HSBC, which is called Climate Asset Management, the idea is really to take what you would call nature and make it an asset class across the economy. And I think over the last sort of 12 months, we've seen a lot of dialogue from some of the major financial institutions and investors talking about the need to invest in biodiversity, the need to invest in land, the need to invest in wildlife. But the truth of that is that those are not themselves existing investment classes. And so while there's a large call for that, what it really comes back to then is how do you invest in doing these more traditional activities like agriculture and forestry in a way that interacts better with the natural capital value of the landscape. And so in the fund that we've created, what we're looking to do is to take more traditional agriculture or forest operations and undertake them in a way that's more sustainable, or that can be done in a way that increases the natural capital value, so that rate of return, which may normally be 6, 7, 8%, is actually increased by an additional 1 or 2% because you have soil carbon or you have some other benefit that arises from that. The ability to do this does depend on the jurisdiction, and in Australia, I guess we're fortunate the government has its emission reduction fund, which does drive investment around carbon offsetting, and that carbon offsetting is actually both at the federal level and particularly in Queensland is given a value by those governments through the various funding mechanisms, whether it's the ERF or the Queensland's Land Restoration Fund. And so in that sense, this ability to get additional value out of agriculture through doing more innovative methods that reduce carbon emissions is very important to creating what is a new asset class. One of the challenges in doing that, though, is that if you take an area like soil carbon, it's still relatively new, it's fairly expensive to do the baselining, the methodology that has been developed is still fairly onerous and costly, and so a lot of the focus in the federal government's technology roadmap is how do you bring costs down so that these techniques can become can basically become cheaper to do, and the economic return is not so difficult. I think in addition, when you can offer those sort of investment products, it then gets the financial sector more interested in what the opportunities are. But when we also look a little bit more broadly at some of the tailwinds that are going on within this space, we're seeing a very large focus on the nature side of investing. So many of you will be aware of the Bank of England launched a task force called the TCFD, which was to look at disclosure in financial investment around climate risk. There is now a very similar significant task force called the Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosure. So large corporates sort of, I guess, revealing what they are doing in terms of investing in so-called nature, and that is gaining significant momentum. And if it gains the momentum that the TCFD did, it'll be quite a driver of investment patterns going forward. And so in this sense, one of the challenges is how do we monetize all this? And as I said before, what we're seeing in the market is, I guess, people trying to understand how they can do these more traditional investments in a way that values nature through soil carbon or through plantings, through avoided deforestation alike. And those are the sorts of methods that are generating offsets under the federal government scheme. For a farmer that's on the ground, often this stuff can be quite daunting and challenging, and there are many players in the market who come around and offer different products to help you monetize the carbon benefits on the land. And there are quite a few of those players. And interestingly, what we've seen over the last, I guess, 6 or 7 months is 3 of those biggest players have actually been on the market for sale and have sold and have actually received large payment for those businesses. So one of the businesses, Green Collar, got acquired by KKR. Another business called Climate Friendly recently got acquired by one of the private equity groups, Anagen Capital. And what that demonstrates is that the finance world is actually valuing the fact that this, I guess, additional stream of carbon can actually add additional revenue to existing operations, but also as a standalone venture on itself. And so the dynamic around that is quite interesting. I think going forward, what has to happen is that, I think increasingly, where there are larger land holdings, farmers will learn how to do a lot of these activities themselves rather than relying on third parties. And so you do need to get the approach the government's offering around undertaking your initial baselines and ongoing measurement. We have to get the cost out. And a lot of things like satellite imaging and data and improved measurement techniques will help drive those costs down. So I think, from our approach, traditionally, people have talked a lot about the importance of investing in agriculture as a natural hedge to portfolios, a natural hedge to climate as well. But we are seeing more and more investors being interested in the space, and with that, this sort of demand for how does the interaction between those activity and nature become all the more important. And then the final thing I'll say is that what's also interesting is what's also driving this is a lot of the large corporates who have committed to net zero are also looking very closely at their supply chains. So they're looking down how throughout my supply chain do I ensure sustainability, do I reduce scope 3 emissions? And companies like Unilever, for example, last week announced a very large net zero emissions implementation plan. And that plan, they took to their annual general meeting to be approved by shareholders. And in that plan, it talks about going all the way down to where products are basically grown in the field. How do you make those sustainable and ensure that at a ground level emissions are being reduced all the way through to the product to the customer? So I think a lot of these drivers are really pushing the interest in ag. And then the final thing I'd say is that on financing itself, we're seeing a lot more of the financial institutions and the banks wanting to be more innovative. So, for example, lending money but reducing the interest repayments on the basis that the farming activities meet certain sustainability criteria. And as they come under pressure from shareholders to do more on working in their supply chains, they're coming up with more innovative products that will help do that. And one of the keys to resolving this is basically the ability to measure what goes on at the farm level on site. So we're also seeing an increasing number of I guess, technologies and data platforms emerging that allows farmers to actually measure those changes, which then feeds into the ability to value that nature change and to value the way in which production occurs. So I'll just end with those sort of high-level comments, if that's okay.
Thanks very much, Martin. Just remind everyone again, if you've got questions, pop them in the Q&A at the bottom. We're going to have an extensive Q&A session at the end of the three speakers. Our next speaker is Jael Bajada. Jael is the Head of Corporate Affairs and Business Leadership Team Member for Syngenta ANZ. She is responsible for guiding the business as it continues to grow, delivering on business sustainability commitments and shaping and telling the story of how Syngenta is helping to increase food supply responsibly and sustainably. Jael will share Syngenta's plan for the future of agriculture in a low emissions economy, current projects and the role of agricultural digital technology in reducing emissions on farm. Thanks, Jael.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you for inviting me to speak today. Now, I'll just make sure that I'm in presentation mode. And I'm assuming that is all good.
All good, Jael.
Thank you. So yeah, I'll just do a little bit of an introduction to Syngenta to start with. Syngenta is a leading science-based research and development company. Our teams around the world use their local knowledge and understanding, together with the breadth of their expertise from across the business, to tailor solutions that create real value for growers. We invest about 1.3 billion in R&D, and that's 2017 numbers, with about 28,000 passionate employees in more than 90 countries around the world. So we're also very committed to rescuing land from degradation, enhancing biodiversity and revitalising rural communities. And I'll go into a little bit more detail around that a bit later. In Australia and New Zealand, our focus is very much around leveraging the best of the R&D that we have globally to deliver growers locally those integrated solutions they need to realise their new levels of performance of productivity and quality in their farming businesses. Our purpose is very much to bring plant potential to life. So we help millions of farmers around the world to grow safe and nutritious food, and we help them manage a very complex set of challenges from nature and society. And that really does call for a step change in productivity and resource efficiency on both the world's 8 million large farms and its 450 million small holdings. Our approach at Syngenta is to ensure that everybody wins, that farmers are prosperous, agriculture becomes more sustainable, and consumers have safe and healthy and nutritious food. Our ambition is to be the most collaborative and trusted team in ag, providing leading seeds and crop protection innovations to enhance the prosperity of farmers wherever they are. As our planet faces increasing environmental challenges, society expects companies to invest their resources where they matter most. And we've listened and responded, and we want to increase trust with stakeholders by delivering a transparent and consultative innovation model that has a positive and lasting impact on farming, the food value chain, and more. We hear regularly about the global food challenge. Every day, our planet wakes with nearly 180,000 more mouths to feed and more farmland lost to erosion. By 2050, we're expected to have approximately 10 billion people on the planet. Syngenta has made 6 commitments to help grow more food using fewer resources while protecting nature. And at the same time, helping people in rural communities live better lives. And we called this the Good Growth Plan. We launched this back in 2013, and since then we've measured our impact on sustainable agriculture through our Good Growth Plan. They were fulfilled in 2020, and I can say very proudly we achieved quite a lot. And you can see just a few achievements there. These our commitments are very much aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals as well. So the challenge isn't over though. So we achieved those from 2013 to 2020, and we still have a long way to go. It's quite a journey. Last year, after conducting extensive research and holding hundreds of discussions with NGOs, industry and consumer organisations, we launched our new and refreshed Good Growth Plan. The key change from our previous plan is very much the focus on climate change. While as a business, we've been engaging in a range of collective efforts around the world, aiming to empower our food and agricultural systems to achieve carbon neutrality, this was the first time that we'd actually brought climate change to the fore and developed a clear plan for the business. We recognise obviously the challenges climate change poses for agriculture and the contribution that we can make to tackle it as well. A changing climate affects growing seasons, water availability, pests, and crop productivity as well. And it hinders farmers' ability to produce better and more abundant food for a growing population. It also impacts our own operations through altered weather patterns and water availability as well. So as I've mentioned before, Syngenta's been engaging in a range of our own climate change collective efforts around the world. We're a founding member of the Climate Smart Agriculture 100 project, which brings together 100 leading food and agribusiness companies to make a measurable science-based commitment against climate change. And that's along with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the World Economic Forum, and the Global Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture, among others. Earlier in 2019, we also began a new partnership with the Nature Conservancy. It's designed to bring innovation for nature. Our collaboration brings together Syngenta's research and development capabilities with TNC's scientific and conservation expertise to scale up sustainable agricultural practices. This has already enabled us to expand our global efforts on sustainable agriculture and giving us the opportunity to apply and test innovative new techniques to enhance soil health, protect natural habitats, and enhance carbon sequestration in agriculture. And we're also a signatory to the World Economic Forum's Alliance of CEO Climate Leaders. This coalition believes the private sector has a responsibility to engage in global efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to help lead the global transition to a low carbon, climate resilient economy. And we also support organisations such as the UN's Convention to Combat Desertification and the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Centre and the International Rice Research Institute. So what are we doing locally? So with this new focus, our new Good Growth Plan puts the urgent fight against climate change and biodiversity loss at the heart of farming's productive future and the global economic recovery. We're making 4 ambitious new global commitments to reduce agriculture's carbon footprint and to help farmers deal with the extreme weather patterns caused by climate change. These commitments, which are driving our innovation, will help farmers and society sustainably recover from the ongoing effects of the coronavirus pandemic as well. So these are our commitments. As part of our plan to accelerate innovation, we've been hard at work to incorporate sustainability into our R&D strategy, having committed $2 billion US into innovations designed to improve agricultural sustainability over the next 5 years as of 2019. So by 2025, we aim to report progress we've made against a few key performance indicators. So reducing emissions from energy use in our own operations and supply chains and logistics, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. Reducing water use in our suppliers' operations, improving the quality of waste and cooling water, and optimizing the use of natural resources and reducing waste, ending use of landfill sites as well. Beyond these goals, though, we'll also continue engaging with farmers to bring them the knowledge, practices, and solutions they need to grow more sustainably, and we will continue to explore how the ag sector can play a larger role in addressing climate change too. And we invite interested stakeholders to join us on this journey as well. Accelerating innovation for farmers and nature, it's very much around investing those funds in meeting those KPIs that I've talked about, but those 2 new sustainable technology breakthroughs per year is a key point there. We are looking at what we can do from a product sustainability perspective, and making sure that the stage gates in our development of our products are very much focused around sustainability of that product, whether it's for the environment, but also for health as well. Striving for the lowest residues in crops and the environment is an important point there too. Striving for carbon neutral agriculture. This is where we're looking to measure and enable carbon capture and mitigation in agriculture. So carbon in soil is very useful for farmers. It helps make that soil more productive. And in Australia's, Australia being one of the driest, I'd say it's the driest continents on Earth, we really do need that carbon in the soil. Enhancing biodiversity and soil health on 3 million hectares of rural land every year is a target of ours, and reducing the carbon intensity of our own operations by 50% by 2030. At the same time, we're also striving to keep people safe and healthy. Goal zero incidents in our operations, training 8 million farm workers on safe use every year, and striving for fair labour across our entire supply chain. To do this, though, we recognise that we need to work with others, and we are very much focused on what we can do in terms of partnering for impact. So I mentioned our partnership with the Nature Conservancy, that's globally. Locally, I'm planning on making an announcement in the next few weeks on a local partnership that will also bring about quite a step change in biodiversity enhancement on farm, and go a long way to helping farmers understand how they can improve biodiversity on their own land. To give you a couple of examples of what we're doing to achieve our good growth plan. One of these is the Reverte program. The Cerrado biome in Brazil is Latin America's largest tropical savanna landscape. It's a hotspot, a global hotspot for biodiversity that has experienced widespread land conversion into agriculture and ranching. The soils have naturally low fertility, and in many areas have actually been impacted by a history of ranching for beef production, leading to the degradation of up to 18 million hectares of soil. This degraded soil either lies barren or has been incorporated into pasture with low productivity. Last year, Syngenta, with guidance from the Nature Conservancy, launched the Reverte program, and it puts in place tools to enable local farmers to restore degraded land. It aims to help farmers or ranchers to make the investment needed to bring degraded pasture land back into cultivation, together with the inputs of an integrated pest management program and guidance that are needed to guarantee the investment's payback for those farmers as well. So the project will lead to an expansion of farmer operations onto unproductive, degraded land, which avoids further deforestation of natural habitat by utilising that land. It also looks to improve yield within an estimated 5 years, and helps farmers actually earn money from carbon storage. So with an initial investment of around $1,500 US per hectare, soil carbon will be stored and credits sold as part of a voluntary carbon market. At an estimated $30 per carbon credit, it's expected to equate to about 1 additional bag of soy per hectare for that farmer. The other project I'd like to highlight today is our Anagen feed project out of our US team. Energy is a key component in maximising beef production, and corn is an important energy source. So when fed as grain, or Anagen feed corn, helps convert starch to sugar more efficiently and rapidly during the digestive process, providing more readily available energy to feeder cattle. More available energy and improved fibre digestibility means greater profit potential for dairy operations. Importantly though, a recently finalised life cycle assessment of beef cattle fed with Anagen corn found that a statistically significant improvement in feed efficiency translates into estimated reductions in environmental impacts, including lower emissions of greenhouse gases and lower use of land, energy and water. So the assessment found that a reduction of greenhouse gases equivalent to removing 35 passenger cars from the road for 1 year, lower land use for growing corn to feed the animals equivalent to about 54 football fields, 6 million fewer gallons of water, enough to fill 9 Olympic-sized swimming pools, and enough energy saved to power 22 average homes for a year. Syngenta's Anagen corn enzyme technology also enhances ethanol production and delivers alpha amylase enzyme directly into the grain. Syngenta has licensed growers to produce Anagen grain to support a growing number of ethanol plants too, representing approximately 3 billion gallons of ethanol capacity, with plans to continue expanding the footprint for this game-changing innovation too. There's also a role of technology in the future of farming. It's an important one. To reach the international and local targets of emissions reductions, we need all the tools in the toolbox. Technology will play a major role in making farming more sustainable without sacrificing productivity or farmers' incomes, and precision agriculture will be a large part of that solution. The World Economic Forum estimates that if 15 to 25% of farmers adopted precision ag, global yield could be increased by 10 to 15% by 2030, while greenhouse gas emissions and water use could be reduced by 10 and 20% respectively. Precision application technology is coming along in leaps and bounds. In some areas of the world, it's still a niche, but especially in extensive row crops where cost of inputs are critical, such as Australian cereals, it's being widely adopted and it's expanding across the globe. Weed control is where it's taken hold first, but there are various types of precision ag. It can be used purely on a location basis, so that banded application there. It can be linked with images and maps from drones or satellites to provide a prescription dose to particular parts of a field, or it can be a little bit more sophisticated. And we are working on a see and spray technology where weeds are identified on the go. And this is the benefit of the application being directly intercepted by the weed. It's not there yet, and there are still some challenges we're working to overcome, but we recently announced a partnership with an artificial intelligence organisation that will help us get to that next stage. Soil degradation is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions as well. Surprisingly, there's 3 times more carbon stored in the soil than in the atmosphere. So when the soil gets disturbed, all of this carbon evaporates into the atmosphere. On top of that, degraded soil can support fewer carbon dioxide absorbing plants. So we are very much looking at how we can enable carbon storage within the soil as well, and soil health. For the products themselves, there's a huge amount of investment in novel technologies. A lot of the regulation in agriculture and pesticides has driven innovation in what might different sorts of crop protection look like. There's also more of an interest in nutrition and vigour in a challenging climate rather than just yield as well, from a seed breeding perspective. We've also moved to a more holistic product profile where sustainability is at the core of a product development and requires an optimal balance of multiple criteria, which I mentioned earlier. But all of this is only useful if you can bring it all together and a farmer can make use of it. So what we're doing is working on an integrated vision of how we develop the models, the tools, the products, the protocols, and the understanding of the agronomy to make the farmer's decision easier in navigating a future low emissions economy. To help them create tailored solutions field by field that work with their agronomic practices as well. And that requires us to work in partnership to bring all of these technologies together. And before I finish off, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about how we're not only aiding farmers to improve the environmental footprint of their business, but we're also taking steps to reduce the impact of our own operations. Since 2017, we've been measuring the direct impact that our own operations have on the environment by studying our own carbon footprint, water usage and waste production. And our findings have been published in our non-financial performance summary, our sustainable business reports, which are available online. In 2019, we finished developing targets with the Science-Based Targets Initiative to cut the intensity of our overall carbon emissions by at least 50% by 2030. Our overall the carbon footprint of our crop protection and our seeds operations has reduced by approximately 11% between 2016 and 2020. And this has mainly been delivered through emissions reductions relating to activities at our manufacturing sites. There are several projects as well looking at ways to reduce the amount of waste that we generate and what happens to it. So we're looking for opportunities to circularize. So for example, we recently ran a successful proof of concept study to isolate a particular raw material for one of our active ingredients manufacturing processes from the waste stream of another. And we're constantly seeking to reduce atmospheric losses at source, utilising the best available technology, and many sites can demonstrate decades of continuous improvement as a result of these efforts globally. We also recently started operating a new manufacturing site at Muttons in Syngenta in Switzerland, and that's the image that we have there in front of us. And this site specialises in scaling up new products from the first commercial launch to the point where volumes are large enough to move to a long-term manufacturing location. And this is a really critical point in the life cycle of the product from a sustainability perspective, as it's an opportunity to learn how we can optimise the process while the volumes remain small. And lastly, our product footprints. And while it's currently a work in progress, we have established the underpinning methodology and are now in the process of scaling it across the portfolio. Part of the challenge is about accurately allocating the footprint relating to each and every activity we do internally in the course of producing and supplying the product in question. So even more challenging is reaching back into our supply chain so that we can also account for the footprint generated by our suppliers and our suppliers' suppliers, etc., as they have made and shipped the raw materials we buy from them. And so we're accelerating a program of engaging with our suppliers to deeply understand their own carbon footprints and to work together with them to reduce it. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, JL. Obviously, a hell of a lot going on at Syngenta at the moment. And again, just remind everyone about the Q&A function. If you've got questions for JL, please put them in there, or we'll have plenty of time to cover them at the end of the session. Our last speaker in this session is Trevor Lucas. Trevor is the head of accumulation at Cooperative Bulk Handling. He is an experienced grain industry manager with a demonstrated history of working in logistics, storage and handling, marketing, trading, and grower accumulations and sales. CBH Group is Australia's largest cooperative and a leader in the Australian grain industry, with operations extending along the value chain from fertiliser to grain storage, handling, transport, marketing and processing. It was established in 1933 and is owned and controlled by approximately 3,700 West Australian grain growing businesses. Trevor will be describing the CBH sustainability journey and their potential path forward, highlighting the need for understanding the economic drivers that will ultimately influence the Australian grain supply chain participants' commitment to change. Thanks, Trevor. Trevor, we don't appear to have any sound for you. No, still no sound.
It might be the headphones issue again, Trevor.
Nothing yet. Still nothing.
I think you'll have to unplug the headphones, I think, Trevor. Sorry.
No good, unfortunately.
Make any noise, so yeah, apologies. Now, again, well, thank you everybody for the opportunity to speak today and represent CBH. So Richard gave a brief introduction as to who CBH are and what we do, but just to reiterate, we're Australia's largest grower-owned cooperative, 4,200 growers. We're a storage and handling provider in Western Australia, so approximately 90% of all grain in Western Australia comes through our network. We're also a processor of flour and intermold, and also oat products as well with BLM. We export about 90% of our grain in Western Australia to the international markets, and approximately 10% of grain comes into the domestic market. We ship about 10 million tonnes out of Western Australia, and then we have a marketing division arm, which is where we come in, and this story sort of takes place in terms of the sustainability journey. So the sustainability journey for CBH started in 2009 with obviously the biofuel mandate into EU. We ship the majority of our GM canola into Europe under a sustainably accredited system. We've chosen ICC. There are other systems out there, one called SAI, but the bulk of Australia's grain or canola that is sent into Europe is under the ICC accreditation. So, we were sort of ticking along for about 8 or 9 years. Just really focused on making sure that we were meeting that market. And then when we look back over that journey, we calculated what sort of value, the premium or the market premium that represented to Western Australian growers, which can be represented by the spread between GM and non-GM canola in Western Australia. And if you add that up over the years, we'll get an average. It's about $40 a tonne, the spread between those two. We've shipped approximately 10 million tonnes of canola into the Euro market over that period. So, just back of the envelope, roughly speaking, that's $400 million of market access premium that's been available to the Western Australian and Australian grower over the journey. So, like I said, we sort of ticked along for 10 years and we didn't really have a major focus on expanding the sustainability story or looking to other customers. We were quite hands off in terms of having proactive discussions with our customers. It wasn't until a couple of years ago that one of our major malting customers in Vietnam, called Anagen, came to us and told us that they were essentially going to be relying on or asking for all of their suppliers to provide sustainably accredited grain. And within that came obviously a carbon reduction plan as well. So what I want to do today is just I'll get Katie to play a couple of videos, because I think in terms of what CBH is doing and what our customers are thinking now, I think it's pertinent to play these videos. We played them at our recent AGM to introduce these themes to our growers as well and our board members. So Katie, if it's possible for you to play those two videos, hopefully your tech is working better than mine.
Hi, I'm Patrick Barton. Great to be here with you today.
And I am Dick van Schijk, and we are part of Heineken's malt and barley sourcing team. We've been working with farmers and co-ops for over a decade to develop sustainable barley. Though the start was modest, about 70% of our barley is sustainable in 2020, and we're rapidly moving towards our ambition of 100%.
All over the world, people are increasingly aware of the impact of human activity on our planet, from bars to restaurants, but also at home. Sustainability is an important factor for many of our consumers, and we see it becoming one of the key drivers for consumer decision-making. As the most trusted international beer brand, we have a clear role to play in leading the brewing industry.
At Heineken, we have a long tradition of reducing our impact on the world. For example, by continuously reducing our water and energy consumption in our brewing process, or decreasing the weight of our packaging. But we realize we cannot do this alone. So we also engage with many of our suppliers in joint CO2 reduction programs.
And finally, we often see that growing sustainably can also come with higher profitability. Many farmers say that after an initial investment, they see sustained reduction in water and fertilizer consumption. Moreover, accreditation is on farm level and valid for all crops produced. More and more corporations are developing their sustainability agendas, resulting in an ever-growing demand for sustainably grown crops. Farmers adopting these practices will be supplier of choice for companies moving into this direction.
We hope to have piqued your interest and are looking forward to continue this journey with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
sustainability to us, it's not just about how we're farming going forward. It's making sure that our kids can farm, but it's also making sure we're producing a product that people want. We're seeing it more and more. Our customers want to know that they're getting a good, healthy, clean product. 2020 was a perfect example of how we cannot rely on one market for our grain going forward. And so it means that it's opening up more markets, Europe and across the world, that we can be selling grain into in the future.
I guess some of the main themes we're hearing from our customers who've been speaking to in the course of our sustainability survey is embedding sustainability through all levels of manufacturing, right from sourcing and then the types of products that they're marketing to their customers. The heaviest demand is coming from Europe, where there's heavy government regulations around sustainability. We're also seeing it from large multinationals who have sustainable sourcing strategies or they want to gain a competitive edge. We've found that countries all over the world are incorporating sustainability strategies into their manufacturing processes, from South Africa right through to Malaysia, and then more recently from Mexico. CBH has had a really good history in looking at sustainability, starting from their ISCC certification on canola to be able to supply to the European biofuels market. So this has put us in a really good position to, well, in this case, expand our ISCC certification to other commodities, allowing us to supply customers with a certified sustainable product.
It's good to guarantee our market access. So obviously Europe's quite an important market for us. So these are the sorts of programs that we need to be involved with. Sustainability for us is also about leaving the land in as good a condition, if not better, than when we took it on. So we're as a family farming operation, we're farming not only for our generation, but our future generation.
All right, thank you, Katie, for playing that. That worked very well. Okay, so a lot of themes in there, which, like I said, tell a pretty good story about where we are in terms of the mega trends going on in the industry, from not only the government perspective, but also our customers. So you've got big multinationals and big customers who are really dedicating themselves to a sustainable path going forward, and this is manifested primarily in the creation of ESGs and having some really hairy, audacious targets on zero carbon and the other 17 SDG goals. So we're finding that more and more over the last couple of years. So this is obviously the flag on the hill for us. To get market access in the future, we're going to have to listen to our customers. We're going to have to look at governments and what the policies are, so that we can then adapt to try and meet their needs. This slide just shows a few of our main customers and some of the comments that are coming out from them. So we recently did a survey of all of our international and well, not all of them, but a good subset of our international and domestic customers. And you can see here a good spread of big customers. Bourke Malton is the largest maltster in Australia.
Trevor, it's Richard. You might just need to share your screen again for the slides.
Sorry. How's that, Rich? All good, Rich?
All good.
All right. So like I was saying, so we've been recently interviewing some of our, or doing a survey on our customers, both domestic and international, and we're getting quite a lot of, similar themes, like I was saying, in terms of, these targets that they are asking for. They're lifting their eyes beyond the scope 1 and 2 and into the scope 3, which are their suppliers, which inevitably is CBH. But for us, that's the grower in not only Australia, not only Western Australia, but all of Australia. Flag on the hill really is, issues, well, not issues, but, Europe could be introducing an import tax scheme as early as 2023. So, for us, added on top of the sustainability accreditation that we're required to have getting into that market, having a tax on carbon is you know, both an opportunity but also a risk for Australian growers if we don't move quickly enough to ensure that, you know, we can effectively and accurately measure our own carbon emissions both through the supply chain and at the grower level to be able to, you know, take some control in this, because we don't know what the methodology is going to be at this stage. But, you know, if we're to be applied a carbon tax that, or if the carbon tax is to apply the cost of a carbon credit in the EU versus the cost of a carbon credit in Australia, for example, well, then the spread is quite significant and would be and Australian growers would be on the wrong side of that. So I'd like to think as an industry we could move to a point where we can accurately, we have tools in place where we can accurately assess our carbon footprints throughout the supply chain, you know, have them verified and potentially offset them if we have to do, or at least have a very good understanding and verified understanding of what our footprints are. So some of the consumer the marketing sustainability with the recent market exercises that we just did, you know, an overview of the responses that we're getting and the trends is, you know, consumer expectations are changing. This isn't just the big companies, this is small companies as well, all seeking to, you know, have when implement ESGs within their businesses. And like I said, some are really lifting their eyes and looking at Scope 3 emissions and how they can influence their suppliers to improve their sustainability performance. Increased concerns about climate change. The demand for sustainability grows after the pandemic. We're seeing, you know, after the pandemic, you know, a lot more attention being paid to being more green, more sustainable, lowering carbon emissions. There's more money being invested into sustainability. Government pressure is not going away, as can be seen by the EU, you know, drawing a line in the sand on potentially taxing carbon as it comes into their country or their countries. Reduced market access for unsustainable goods. If we don't move, if we never implemented sustainable grain in Australia, we wouldn't have access to the premium paying European market. There could be more markets on the way with that, with those sort of requirements. But just to sort of sum up, the economic drivers for lowering carbon emissions in Australia throughout the supply chain and at the grower level. You know, number one for us is market access. I mean, we lost, you know, China last year for the barley market. You know, that sort of really drove home to us the importance of finding new markets for not only Western Australian grain. Having sustainably accredited, for example, and or lowering emissions could give us an edge in that initiative or that impediment to find new markets. Unfortunately, since China did ban Australian barley or put a hefty tariff on it, we have found new markets. Anagen, for example, we've sold additional cargoes of ICC Plus accredited grain, not only in Vietnam, which was where the original ship was loaded almost 15 months ago. We've subsequently sold another additional 2 ICC Plus accredited ships into Mexico this year. You may have heard some of that on the news. There are other countries that we're actively promoting ICC Plus grain as well with success. Customer supplier requirements are changing. So this is the biggest change in the last 5 years. It's the customers' requirements. It's the need for customers to have a sustainable plan, to have a robust ESG, and they're asking us to support them. They're asking our growers to support them. So subsequently, CBH, we're there to tell the grower what the market wants and what they can expect, in terms of market access and potential premiums. So moving into the new markets and products, I just mentioned, Heineken and markets that we found based on the back of sustainable products. There's a potential for carbon neutral grain. We just did with the recent survey, some interesting results came back from that in terms of our customers' willingness to pay a premium for carbon neutral grain. 60% said they wouldn't, 40% said they would. So you can take that either way, whether you think that's a large number that would. For me, personally, I think it's quite a supportive response to that question. And linking niche products to low emissions and other green trades. So we're looking at we've asked customers about MRL free, safe food and traceability, and they all came back very strong on the priority list for our customers. So we'll be working with industry and growers to potentially match those products with our customers' demand. And just the final comment is that especially in this is a Western Australian centric sort of stat, but on average we export 90% of our grain in international markets. So we don't have the luxury of just sitting back and saying she'll be right and you take the grain the way we produce it. We have to listen. We have to adapt, and CBH is very well committed in terms of linking these two markets. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Trevor. We got there in the end after the technical difficulties, and thanks for persevering, everyone. We heard you really well in the end. So if we get Jael and Martin to switch their cameras back on, and we can jump into, we've got about 25 minutes now for Q&A. There's a few questions in there, but I'm just going to start with a couple to begin with. And this one's really, I guess, to Jael and Trevor to start.
Session 3 of our online forum. Thank you very much for staying with us. I thought coming towards the end of the day, we would do something a bit different for today's final session. So we've invited 4 farmers who you'll meet shortly who are going to share with you their personal and their business story and provide us with some practical examples about how people are actually living with adapting to our changing climate, reducing emissions and responding to pretty much a constant change around market signals. 4 very different people from different regions and production systems, so you're going to get a real cross-section and diversity of views. This session is only going to work if the people on the webinar share ideas, thoughts and questions in the Q&A box. Each of our farmers will introduce themselves for 5 minutes, and then we'll get the discussion going, and we want you to jump in and be part of it. Just a reminder to everyone that this session is being recorded because we plan to share it afterwards on the CRSPI website. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Kath Sullivan, who has very kindly agreed to be our interviewer facilitator for this afternoon's discussion. Kath is the National Rural Reporter with the ABC, and she's based at Parliament House here in Canberra. So over to you, Kath.
Thanks very much, Anwen. Thank you to all of those who've taken the time to tune in. Very much looking forward to hearing from some real people, which is something I think Parliament House often misses. So looking forward to reaching outside of the bubble and talking about some really important policy areas, which is also something I think that's maybe been missing from Parliament House in recent times. Look, I've already decided to get political. Let's park that there. Very much looking forward to your questions. Pop your hand up. Let me know if you want to jump in at any time. I think that will be the best way for this conversation to really kick off and get going. Now, the instructions from Anwen are for each of our guests to introduce themselves. That way I can't get it wrong. So with that in mind, we might invite Richard Heath, who comes to us today from South Australia. And you're first online, Richard, so you can have the pleasure or the misfortune.
Thanks very much, Kath, and yeah, thanks very much for having me as part of this panel. I look forward to sharing some thoughts. Yeah, I'm a grape grower and wine producer from McLaren Vale, which is about 45 minutes south of Adelaide. Quite a traditional grape growing region, one of the oldest in Australia. I'm second generation producer here with my brother and I now taking over the business, which is a multifaceted sort of wine company, if you like. We've got about 60 hectares of vineyard, family owned, that we run. And I also run a viticultural management company doing about another 150 hectares for a number of different clients within the McLaren Vale region. On top of that, we've got a little wine brand that my brother and I have started that predominantly uses fruit from our own vineyards. So we buy a little bit of fruit in, but most of it's homegrown, with a focus generally on new and emerging, what we would call, what have been dubbed alternative varieties, but I would now call them climate appropriate varieties for our area. So that's probably been our first step into, you know, the challenges that we've started to see around, you know, a moving climate, whether it be temperature or rainfall or a combination of all those. That little business has just become certified carbon neutral through the government's Climate Active program. We're the first wine brand in South Australia to achieve that status, and only the third in Australia, with a couple of others coming from New South Wales. So yeah, we've got a lot of things going on at the moment, you know, working our way through this you know, these challenging times, and we'll you know, hopefully we'll add a bit more to that as we go along.
Give me a bit slow on the mute button. Thank you for that introduction, Richard. Looking forward particularly to getting perspective from your industry as our only grape grower as part of the conversation today. Very different challenges, I'm sure, that you're facing, particularly compared to Bridget Price, who's an organic beef producer joining us from Queensland. I hope, have we got you on the line there, Bridget?
Yes, hi Kath, can you hear me?
Over to you.
Excellent, thank you. So I am a member of an intergenerational farming family. So we are built on hard work and resilience of future generations. And we're very focused on our future stakeholders, not our shareholders, who are our children and the next generations to come. We think a little bit differently in our business, mainly because my husband is an intergenerational farmer, but I am the city chick. So whereas his work is his life, I always thought, you know, your work's supposed to give you a life. So we've had an interesting marriage over the years. My background was originally as a finance director with Queensland Health. So naturally, my husband gets the operational side of things and I get all of the compliance, bookwork and those things. So in our business, adapting over the years, we've really looked to decide, okay, well, we actually want to be proudly profitable beef producers. We already look after the environment. We've got environmental stewardship and that at the forefront. But also we wanted to be profitable, so we looked at premium markets. So we were really looking at what we were doing and where we could get certification that would actually back up what we're doing. So that's how we started down the organically certified process. And then from there, we looked then to what are the future trends. So we saw that as being best management practice. So we then got involved and became certified in that area as well. Unfortunately, in Queensland, that process became quite political. So when that ended, we then looked around and thought, well, what's the next opportunity for our business to co-brand? So that's when we got involved and I started looking into the carbon market and how we could be co-brand our product organic and carbon neutral. Already in terms of how we're adaptive, we acknowledge that our seasons are changing and the climate looks a lot different to how it did. So we look very much to have adaptive animals that suit our climate. We are really strict on our breeding, on the fertility, on genetics. We're working really hard with that. We've gone into infrastructure. So we've looked at water programs where our cattle don't have to walk more than 1 kilometre. So we're looking at highly fertile cattle. Every breeder must bring a calf into the yards. We cull on temperament. We look for weight gain. So we're doing all of those things as well in our business. And then the process, recently was looking into what we can do in the carbon market. So that's been a really interesting area because I'm the analytical one in our business. So we wanted to then look to go, there is a lot of, at the moment, predominantly in beef, I won't say a marketing exercise, but for a lot of people, and if you have the growth and the scope, you can buy the
and I'm not to cut you off, Bridget, I might just
overseas, but we look to do it through practice change. And so we became involved in the Methods to Market program, which is looking at how those eco services.
And Bridget, not to cut you off, although I think your network or my network is having a fair crack at trying to disrupt this conversation. That way we know you're legitimately in regional Australia. And certainly that is one of the challenges that a lot of people face.
Sorry, did you want me to finish? Or?
Can we just try that again, Bridget, if we've still got you there? Let's just see if we can sort out Bridget's bandwidth. Not an easy thing to sort out in a couple of minutes' time. We might find a better reception space. While we do that,
is it better if I turn my video off?
Yes, as much as we'd love to see you, let's try it without the video. If you just wanted to, I think we cut out there just as you were telling us how analytical you were in your approach to approaching both the organic and carbon market forms of marketing for what it is that you produce there.
Hi, can you hear me? I can see Kath's on mute, no? Sorry.
Yeah, you have the microphone,
Yep.
Bridget.
Excellent. Okay, is that better? I honestly, I have brought my husband's portable antenna that he takes fishing to try and get better internet service, and it's telling me I have 4 bars, but yeah, unfortunately in our rural towns, it's not so great. So yeah, look, in a nutshell, we have a 17, 15, 11-year-old children. We have that intergenerational commitment. My role is that analytical, how do we maximise our markets through what the big guys are doing, and looking at that, we recognised a few years ago that under the governance issues that there are, that climate change has been identified as a risk. So the big guys are now bringing it into their policies because the directors will be liable. So in our business, we wanted to look at, taking that information and what we can do. So we then became looking into the markets and what markets are available, and the local methods to market in Queensland. There's a project in there looking at how not only just efficiencies, but also how ecosystem services can be recognised. So we have that whole of business approach right across from our breeders to the infrastructure that we put in, ensuring they don't walk more than a kilometre to water. So I'm not sure what I repeated before, but yeah, so that's what we're doing.
That's okay. We can have a bit of repetition as long as the message sinks in. Bridget, I'm looking forward to hearing more from you, including how your husband uses an antenna to catch fish. But before we get on to that, let's cross the country to Simon Warwick, who's a grain grower from WA and chair of the Ag Zero 2030 in that state, which aims to have to be a carbon neutral grains industry by 2030. Have we got you on the line, Simon? How's your internet connection today?
I'm hoping it's quite good, Kath. Can you hear me all right?
You look and sound great.
Thank you. Yeah, I farm with my partner Cindy and 3 kids at Corrigan, which is 250 k's east of Perth. It's in the medium rainfall zone. We grow broadacre crops to run cattle and sheep. We both have agriculture science degrees and have worked in the industry in other roles. So we are farming in a changing climate. In the last 20 years, we have lost 20% of our growing season rainfall. 3 of 5 of our dry seasons on record have occurred in the last 10 years. 2010 was our dry season on record, almost 30% drier than the next driest year at that point. This is consistent across the Southwest Land Division, which is particularly vulnerable to climate change. So we're also experiencing heat stress events, more frost events, and water supplies becoming a critical issue for our livestock and spraying operations. From 2010 to 2014, I was involved in the Climate Champion program, which was focused on farmers sharing experiences about adapting to climate variability. But what we soon learnt is that we were actually talking about how we were responding to climate change. And we were supported by scientists and Bureau of Met staff, etc. in that program. through that period, I became quite familiar with our local trends and realised that we needed to really focus our decision making on responding to those issues I mentioned, such as the drier seasons. So just some key management practices that we have adopted is we've made a large swing to growing longer season barley and sowing very early in dry, one to minimise frost risk, but also to improve the efficiency of water use for this crop. We let go of a property east of Corrigan, which was predominantly heavier soil types and was proving to be unprofitable during the dry seasons due to the soil texture and the frost risk. We've introduced livestock back into our system, coupled with sowing fodder crops. The autumn period is the period where we've lost most of our rainfall. So we're finding annual pastures aren't good enough for livestock anymore, but with high livestock prices, those enterprises are proving to be profitable. We've introduced chem fallow, we're growing summer crops. We've done a lot of soil amelioration with inverting soils to address our non-wetting problems. We've got a stronger focus on the costs of our business as well. So we've been adapting to the changes, but we're not sure that we can keep up with climate change through adaptation alone. And there's a whole range of new issues that we're facing from our point of view, such as market access, complicated emerging carbon markets, also climate change risk criteria with finance and insurance. So we've also identified that we need to adapt to these issues as well. So recently, our advisor assisted us doing some carbon calculation of our farming business, and we, at the moment, are emitting 1,500 tonnes per annum. So we're exploring ways to either reduce emissions or offset that through tree planting, which would be approximately 200 hectares of tree planting. And the next step would be, do we partner with an investor or do we retain those credits ourselves to be carbon neutral, which could then be used in succession, for example? Because we grow lots of barley and we're supplying brewers, we've noticed that a lot of the key brewers across the planet are carbon neutral, so they're going to want carbon neutral barley. So yeah, they're the sort of key things that we're dealing with at the moment.
Thank you so much, Simon. It's going to be a really interesting part of this conversation is dealing with climate versus dealing with market adaptation in terms of what's going on. Just before we do kick off the conversation proper, I'd like to introduce you to Nan Bray, who's a wool grower from Tasmania. Nan, tell us a little bit about yourself and what it is that you do there.
Thank you, Kath, and thank you for Crispy for inviting me to join the panel. You can tell from my accent that I might have had a slightly different pathway to where I am than the other panelists. I'm from the US originally. I've been in Australia for about 25 years, haven't lost the accent. My parents actually grew up on the land in Idaho during the Depression years. And I grew up with farming stories and I always kind of wanted to be a farmer. But my parents were convinced that you couldn't make a living at farming. And that's what their childhoods taught them. So they insisted that I needed to have a career, which I did. So I became a marine physicist and climate scientist and came to Australia in 1997, mostly because because I fell in love with Tasmania, but also I really was looking for something a bit different than the life that I had in California. And I actually got a job with CSIRO so that I could emigrate, became the chief of CSIRO's Marine Division in Hobart, which was an interesting challenge. Talk about politics, Kath. It really dropped me in the deep end. Anyway, after about 6 years of that, I got brave enough to start farming, give up my salary. And I didn't know what I was doing at all, but I wanted to work with sheep and particularly with superfine merinos. So that's what I did. For about the first 10 years of my farming experience, because I didn't know what I was doing, I just followed the more or less conventional wool growing techniques for Tasmania. And by maybe 8 or 9 years into that, it became clear to me it wasn't working. It wasn't working financially. It wasn't working emotionally. I didn't like the way the farm looked. I was losing money. And it just wasn't the kind of career I had envisioned. So I decided either I needed to make a radical change or find a third career. So about that time, I happened onto some wonderful research from a guy who was working in Utah, University of Utah at that time, Fred Provenza, looking at the effect of biodiversity on animal livestock nutrition. And that was kind of the key piece that I realized I had been missing up to that point. And it allowed me to make a pretty radical directional change in terms of my farming. So the key idea there is that it is the secondary compounds in plants that animals graze that do two things. One is they limit the amount that an animal will eat by creating a post-ingestive feedback, which tells the animal, whoops, you ate a little too much of that, next time go a bit more lightly on it. But also those secondary compounds, which are things like tannins and alkaloids, terpenoids, are pharmaceuticals. They are the basis of human pharmaceuticals as well as pharmaceuticals in an animal sense. So that as the animals move from plant to plant, because of the limitations that those secondary compounds cause them to stop eating this plant, move to another plant, they're actually getting a whole range of nutritional benefits. So if you can keep enough diversity in your forage and your animals can learn how to access it, what to eat when they need it, you can actually maximize the animal's health, which is a completely different approach than what I've been doing for the previous 10 years, which was maximizing the number of animals I could grow. So a couple of things happened there. The animal welfare side of things started to work for me really well. The landscape started to look much better because in order to have biodiversity in your landscape, you have to reduce the grazing pressure. So, that part all worked really well. I reduced the grazing pressure by about 30%, but I still wasn't making money. So my parents were still right at that point. After a few years of that, I was really happy with the farming side of things. So I decided to explore moving up the supply chain. And at that point, over a couple of years and many setbacks, ended up with the idea of having my fiber turned into hand knitting yarn and retaining ownership of it and selling that directly, both retail and wholesale. So I have basically all of my fiber is now processed in New Zealand, returns to me ready for sale, and I sell it through my website and through shops. And that finally has given me the income that my parents really never believed could happen. And it lets me farm the way I want to. So that means a very low stocking rate, very high biodiversity. Some of the other animal welfare pathways I've taken is I no longer dock sheep's tails because the nutrition is good enough. I don't have to worry about scouring and other problems, which have always caused us to dock tails. And most recently, I've decided to let my sheep live out their natural lifetimes on the farm. So I'm now learning about sheep geriatrics and yes, just actually enjoying the fact that I have a flock of sheep that the numbers don't change from year to year, because partly, trying to keep the grazing pressure where I want it to be, but also the knowledge that they have is now being passed on from one generation to the next within the flock.
That sounds sheep geriatrics. It certainly has been a different career, I think, to perhaps what you envisaged back in California, at least, Nan. Thank you so much for joining us today, and to all of our panelists. If you'd like to send a question through via the Q&A chat, please do. We've already got somebody who's quite interested, Richard, in the wine access to markets that you're seeing, and whether or not you can attract a premium because of the approach that you've taken with regenerative management, and I don't see why that question can't apply to each of you. So Richard, do you want to tell us about your experience there?
Yeah, it's interesting, Kath. I mean, certainly, the fairly direct question about the carbon neutral access point, it's fairly new for us. The short answer is, I think so. We've seen a fair bit of interest, not only in Australia, but also externally in markets, particularly European markets, are very mature when it comes to talking about carbon and carbon pricing and how it works as a system, much more mature than we are. And they're highly attuned to organic and certification systems as well. So I think the long term it will open up markets for us. I think it will also there's a reporting mechanism that's coming for overseas markets as well, and a little bit like Simon's saying, you know, whether it be retailers who are going down the carbon neutral path, or whether it's producers or whoever it is. I think this is a commodity, if you like, that's going to be part of the future trade for our industry. So yeah, we looked at it certainly from that point. We also looked at it from a management tool, you know, in our business to find where the pinch points were. Obviously, you know, our farming practices, we're on the regenerative agriculture approach. I've just finished a Nuffield scholarship in 2019 that was based around, you know, looking at regenerative ag systems in all farming systems and seeing what we could plug into the wine industry. So our business is in the process of a bit of a production change, the way we do things. So this measuring carbon obviously helps us look at what other parts we can change, whether that be part of the farming process or part of packaging or part of production, where we can lower our emissions and hopefully somewhere along the line become, you know, carbon positive rather than just carbon neutral internally. So it's a moving beast, but I think it's certainly going to play a fairly large role in our business moving forward.
And what about you, Simon? I feel like when I go to the Bottle-O, you can get all different sorts of craft beers and low carb beers, but not carbon neutral. I don't think I've seen yet.
From my understanding, the likes of Heineken are carbon neutral as a brewer, and we've been receiving some market signals or correspondence from their buyers that they're investigating buying carbon neutral barley from farmers. So we'd certainly be interested in that. I guess that's the carrot approach. We're also a little bit concerned about the stick approach as well, such as some of the signals coming out of Europe with carbon border adjustments, etc. I guess in Western Australia, generally we're quite efficient, larger scale type farmers. So it may not be such an impediment for us to be carbon neutral, may in fact be an advantage, but we need to get on with the job of baselining our carbon, and from there sort of understanding what we need to do to reduce emissions.
And you touch on the European, the EU sort of hinting or pointing towards perhaps carbon tariffs, which I mean, it remains to be seen what happens there when negotiating a free trade agreement. Are you getting your signals though from government policy, from the climate as you see it affecting your farm? I mean, the 20% loss of rainfall where you are, what's driving you to make these decisions?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's probably, I mean, we just personally, we feel like we need to be part of the solution as a family. We have, our kids are educated on climate change and they're asking us what we're doing about it. So there's from that point of view, but it's also about being on the front foot as well. I mean, we need to be able to respond to anything that comes our way, and we've adapted quite well, but you know, the rainfall is starting to decline so much that really we need this sort of global response as quick as possible. So I guess we're limited individually what we can do, but you can't sing from the rooftops if you're not doing it yourself. So I suppose that's another motivation as well.
That's really interesting. And each of you have spoken about your families and I think quite a holistic approach to what it is that you do. And Bridget, you talked about farming with your husband and making these decisions and working together for the kids, I think you referred to as the future stakeholders on your farm. Is that driving a lot of your decision making?
Oh, absolutely, because the information that they're getting, we have to be accountable to them as well. And really climate is one of the many risks for us. So we also think that the carbon neutral path is going to be more not necessarily securing your premium markets, but actually protecting your market, as opposed to using our business such as coal seam gas. So our children are involved in that, and the impact of the soil disturbance there and the follow on in that, who's accountable when you don't have, because in our business we aim for 100% ground cover for 100% of the time. So there's a whole range of factors that impact us, but absolutely we bring our children in because we want to expose them to all of the demands and all of the processes that we go through in terms of due diligence as to why we choose to do things and why we don't. But yeah, that next generation is incredibly aware. I have a son that takes off into the mountains with his dog to look at, you know, the history and, you know, the Indigenous heritage and all of that. So they're incredibly connected. And I think just because of the way they grow up, like my husband and my son, who's now 17, they live, love and breathe what they do. So it's not just financial, it's also, well, how do we know we are doing the right thing? And how do we know we're not just regenerating the country, but we're learning the lessons every generation does to see what we can do to make it better?
That said, Bridget, I've got a lot of questions asking about the hip pocket and the financial bottom line. So can you tell us about the cost of implementing these changes on your property in Queensland, like ensuring the ground cover and those animal welfare practices? Are you seeing the returns compensate for the cost of doing that? And this is a question from Paul that I'll come to each of you and ask.
Absolutely, I can, in terms of organic, because we're organically certified, that was really looking around at what are we doing anyway in terms of our animal practices. Now we run less cattle. We can't supplementary feed, so we can't bring feed in when it gets dry. We do have a mineral lick that we give our cattle. So we run less cattle, but we've actually, in doing what we're doing, we're really strict on, as we said, our cattle and our grazing management. So that wet season spelling, planting legumes to improve weight gains. We do feed budgets, so we utilise less than 50% of our production. And all of those things that we do, plus significant water infrastructure. In the last dry spell which we've had, we were the only producer in our area who didn't foresell future years' cattle. So we got very close looking at what we might have to do, but in terms of making that decision to go organic and then have to look after the country and make sure that, you know, the crown of your plant, you know, isn't chewed down too far, it's actually more financially rewarding for us in terms of our hip pocket. And we've been able to do it on scale. So it's definitely, yeah, it's definitely more profitable for us to go down the path that we are.
And Nan, you touched on it before. You said that you had to start your own wool manufacturing business to ensure that you were getting over or convincing the bank that you had a right to stay where you are. What sort of margins are there in it? And I mean, the fact that you've got all these geriatric ewes hanging around the joint, that can't be cheap either, can it?
No, it's a really good question. And I was listening to several of the things that Bridget said and nodding away, because a part of my commitment is also that I will not supplementary feed. And since I won't kill my sheep either, it does mean that I have to be really careful about maintaining the flock level where I know that I can sustain the biodiversity the way I want it to. So there's a lot of balancing acts in this, and also there's no real manual. So to a great extent, we're experimenting, and our experiments often take us a year before we really know the answer. So I think it's probably, people may not necessarily think about sort of both the timeframes and the courage that's required to try some of these different things to see what works in your specific production system. So in terms of the costs, certainly by shifting to animals that were able to maintain their own health, self-medicate, balance their diets. That has certainly reduced my costs. So for instance, I no longer have to treat for intestinal parasites. I haven't drenched a sheep for 11 years, which is not just a cost, but also a labor for me because I'm it. And I don't know how many of you have ever tried to drench a big, strong ewe. You might get away with it once. When she knows what you're about to do, she puts her head down and she will not lift it up. So not having to drench is huge for me. It also, of course, altered the production of wool. So I had a jump over the first couple of years when I first started reducing my stocking rate, getting the nutrition right, of about 40% more wool growth per animal, which is pretty phenomenal. It still wasn't enough to offset the amount that I needed to reduce in terms of the stocking rate. But the quality of the wool, the tensile strength is probably the main characteristic that we worry about. It's very hard to maintain an even plane of nutrition, which is what you need to keep your tensile strength high. So a lot of things sort of came into play once I got that into place. But still, you know, my costs for growing a kilo of greasy wool are just about the market price in a good year. So when I've shifted up the supply chain, what that did was it then put me really in a hole for about 3 years because not only was I not selling my greasy wool, I was putting about $70 a kilo into processing. And so that was when the bank and I started to have some interesting discussions. I nearly sold the sports car that I bought when I was chief, but
how scary was it taking that leap, Nan? Did you think twice? You sound so confident.
I didn't really think twice. I knew I had to do something. And I was in the fortunate position of not having dependents in the first instance, so I wasn't trying to put any kids through school. I'm also single, so I didn't have to argue with a partner about whether this was a good idea or not. So those decisions were not that hard. Also, I think I'm unduly optimistic. So even though I didn't do the market research or any of the things you should have done, I kind of lucked out. I landed in a niche market where the people who are interested in my wool are interested because of the way I grow it. They want to know that my animal welfare bona fides are good. They believe that, you know, that the wool is traceable back to me, which is an issue I think we might want to come back to later in the discussion, because until you can really make that direct connection with your market, and like most wool growers in Australia sell through an auction system, and there is no traceability. So there's no way to bring the accountability back or to have the conversation that I've been able to have directly with my customers, who are just so pleased that they know that they can rely on that I'm doing what I said I am doing. To answer your question about margins, I now wholesale, I make about that additional $70 a kilo. Retail, I do better, but I don't sell as much retail as I do wholesale.
Okay, well, certainly keeping the bank manager from the door by the sound of it.
It pays the vet for those older sheep too.
Yeah. Thanks, Nan. Richard, I guess your winemaking is sort of interfacing with customers and consumers. They'll tell you exactly what they think, given half the chance. What are you finding in terms of making the change? I mean, we talked about perhaps being offered a premium for carbon neutral product, but what about in terms of covering your costs by making that shift?
Yeah, if we look at the changes we had to make, Kath, were seriously expensive at the time. I mean, we're an intensive system, so to change over from traditional French varieties that were planted on one of the properties of about 25 hectares, they were just unsaleable. They'd got to a point where the climate was damaging the fruit quality, but also that they just run out of puff in terms of market saleability. So something had to change, and part of the reason we led ourselves into the, this emerging climate appropriate variety interface was that obviously that was happening in the background, and we're talking, sort of 10 to 12 years ago for the earliest ones of them, where we needed some varieties that could cope with heat spikes during summer, were, I wouldn't say drought resistant, but they're more productive with the amount of water we've got. We're very limited with the amount of groundwater we're allowed to use. But setting all that up was really expensive. So, a traditional Shiraz vine that you put in the ground could cost anywhere from $1 to $2.50. These varieties all got to be imported from Europe, go through quarantine, sit in aqueous for 3 years. So they're $6 to $7 a vine. So when you're planting 1,500 to 2,000 vines per hectare, it becomes very expensive very quickly. We're now seeing the benefit of that. And some of that was a bit like Nan. I was overly optimistic and took a deep breath and went, this will be fine. And we've created a market out of that. And for that reason, that's part of the reason why we ended up going into the wine brand side, because we had something different. They were small batches. No one else really had it. So we knew we had a bit of an advantage in terms of market, and that's grown since then. So, 10 years down the track with the wine brand now mature and functioning, yep, it was a very good decision and it's working quite well. And yes, they are more productive with the amount of water we've got. That doesn't mean they're bulletproof, but they certainly are much more appropriate to what we're seeing in terms of change. The other bit that we're trying to change is our production system, a little bit like Simon. What can we change? How do we enhance soil profile? How do we capture as much water as we can? How do we hold it for as long? So we're changing the way we do our grape growing, and that is taking time to, work out what works and what doesn't. But, in the last 12 months, we would have seen a reduction in about 20% of tractor passes on farm. We've replaced that with livestock during winter and early spring before vines burst. So we've now got a livestock trading business as well of around 300 head, which is cattle and sheep, depending on properties. So that's added income at least, but it certainly pays for itself. And at the moment, the livestock, with livestock prices it's quite profitable. So, we're fine-tuning our system along the way, and I think that's adding to the bottom line, and that's without getting into whether we can drive carbon and use that as a tool to perhaps make money along the way as well. But the answer is yes, and the carbon neutral thing is so early. I mean, we're only really six months into that process that that'll take time to tell. But I think the signs are positive. But I'm a bit like Nan. We can't wait for. And Simon, we can't wait for it to all happen. We need to be on the front foot, and we accept that some of the stuff we're doing we won't get right. But if we wait for the perfect answer, we'll be left behind.
Kath, you're on mute.
Kath, you're on mute.
Just tricking. Thanks, Richard. Sorry, guys. Questions come through the Q&A chat forum asking about whether the industry organisations that you work with have been involved in negotiations with the EU or UK ahead of these free trade agreements, and talking about carbon border adjustments and how they'll be worked out. And if I could just jump in there, I think a colleague of mine was listening to Senate estimates just last week where the Department of Agriculture was asked if it had done any modelling on what carbon tariffs could potentially mean, and it said it hadn't done that work or hadn't been required to do that work just yet. So I'd be really interested to see what your organisations are telling you about that. Nan, do you want to kick off?
Yes, there, I've unmuted. I don't have any direct knowledge about that, Kath, but I am working, one of my wholesale customers has a relatively new fashion business, which is global, and fashion's had a bit of a revolution with regard to a number of these issues over the last year or so. So she's really very concerned with how to get her whole supply chain not just sustainable and ethical in the way that she wants it to be, but also dealing with carbon and emissions issues. So I get a little bit of feedback from that, and I think what I'm seeing from that is I think there's still a lot of issues around getting sort of credible estimates of carbon on farm and also emissions. For grazing, the issue is probably mostly emissions and not so much the carbon side of things. But it's been really interesting to me to see that being driven back down, my supply chain by the end user of the fiber. And so I'm very interested to hear what some of the other panelists' experience has been with it.
Empowering the consumer or consumer-led revolution, perhaps. Bridget.
Sorry, just say one more thing. I think that has really held back the wool industry, the fact that we have not had that feedback coming back all the way to the growers from the consumers, other than sort of anecdotally. It gets much more personal when your customer calls you up and says, I need to know, are you doing this, and this? And I think that's going to drive a lot more change.
Interesting. And that all comes to the marketing process as well, and how many steps are in the supply chain, I guess. Bridget, what about you and the beef industry? What's going on in terms of finding out what the rest of the world makes about how we handle this challenge?
Look, I suppose from that grassroots perspective, I know nationally we've got the National Farmers going for the 2030, and that was, a lot of the initiatives that our industry peak body, who the Cattlemen's Union come under, they have been at the forefront. So a lot of the policy and a lot of what they've put forward is what the federal government has then taken on board. So at that higher level, there's positive progress, but the gap is actually, while great work gets done at the top of agriculture and we're working really hard, we actually quite often miss that connecting loop. So I believe in Queensland, the local ag force weren't so keen to back that because there were too many concerns for them. So, which has been raised this morning on topics like, if agriculture is used as an offsetting the land, then that once another industry is then going to get benefits. So in terms of beef production, I think we've got there's cattle on over 50% of Australia, but we've got areas now being locked up, taking cattle out of them. And the problem with that is, we've got social issues. There's no longer people in those towns. We've got pest issues. So there's a lot of concerns from that point of view. If agriculture, and I suppose while we keep having these discussions at that local level and other industries are jumping on board, because at that corporate level, climate change is an identified risk. So they're acting on it, and they're snaveling up all their stuff. So we could absolutely do a much better job in taking a position and really taking people along. And a lot of our cases, the issues, we don't reward so much the producers that are the standout producers doing the right thing and really looking at how do we improve our carbon soil. We look at things like where the land might have been a bit degraded before. So the focus is actually on rewarding those people by, if you now lock up your land, you can get money that way. Whereas, so for us, the Land Restoration Fund in Queensland, we took part, we got the consultant in, we went through that, but basically they said, we're doing such a good job under the current ways that the methods get analysed. They got their $3,500, so they made money. But there was really nothing at that level for us in the way the current system is set up. So lots of issues for us.
And for you, Simon, the grains industry, in terms of what the rest of the world is up to, do you keep an eye on that, or you're more focused on what you can control at home?
Yeah, I mean, we have our own responsibility to try and work out what's going to likely happen so we can position ourselves as farmers. We also have a strong cooperative in Western Australia called CBH, and I know they're doing some market research as well at the moment on sustainability criteria and emissions and stuff, and it'll be interesting to see the results of that work, just because they market a lot of our grain. I'm not surprised that the federal government is behind the 8 ball with the policy side of things. It's been the case for a long while, and there's been like the peak bodies are really stepping up, like Richard mentioned, and there's other organisations like Farmers for Climate Action that really shouldn't be here. We shouldn't need these organisations, but they're trying to advance the conversation because it hasn't been happening. And we've got a group in WA called Ag Zero 2030, and we are trying to open the conversation on these things as well, because we need to be prepared and we need to act.
Just on that, Simon, a question earlier went to, I think it's actually, maybe Nan's already answered it because it's disappeared off the list, but it went to the conversation that you have with other growers or other farmers, maybe in your community or broader. Are people interested in the changes that you're making on farm and what you're doing? Are you actively trying to push what it is that you're doing? What sort of conversations do you have? Do your neighbours look at you like you've got 3 heads because of your approach? What's it like at your farm?
I hope not. Look, I think West Australian farmers and farmers in general adapt anyway. You know, whether they believe or accept the science of climate change, generally they're adapting to improve the efficiency or the productivity of their business, and generally they're aware of the trends. So that's a given. However, you know, all these emerging issues on market access and where's agriculture's role in mitigation, there is a fair bit of confusion, and it's been coined carbon confusion or climate confusion. There's a lot of interest in carbon projects now from investors. We have a large gas industry in Western Australia, and they're reading the tea leaves and working out that they're going to have to offset their emissions. So they're looking at farming land to do that. So yeah, there is a real need for peak bodies and other organisations and government to provide some clear information, communications, so farmers can really get their head around these things and make informed decisions.
And what's been your experience, Richard? Have you found that people are interested? I mean, you mentioned it's 10 years now since some of those varieties. You're getting more established. Are others interested in what you're doing?
Oh, most definitely, Kath. I mean, in terms of the varieties, yeah, we're still talking niche markets in comparison to the whole of the Australian wine industry. But in McLaren Vale, it's a very proactive region, and we've seen a number of small producers, enter into the wine selling landscape on the back of these alternate varieties. So yes, they will play a part as we go forward. Do I think that they'll overtake Shiraz and Cabernet as our major grape varieties? Probably not. But we're having if I'm planting a vineyard tomorrow, I'm planting it for the next 30 years, and we're having serious discussions at home now about Shiraz vineyards that are 30 years old that need some regeneration. Do we actually plant Shiraz? Now that you would have been coined certifiable 10 years ago to suggest that we were going to pull out Shiraz and McLaren Vale and plant Nero d'Avola or Montepulciano or something from Portugal, and that's going to be our next variety. So the conversation has moved considerably to the future, and that's going to involve some of these traditional varieties falling off the wayside or at least becoming reduced. And yeah, farming practices, again, I'm lucky to live in a region that's quite proactive, very open-minded. It's not to say the wine industry is a little bit like every other farming industry. It's bound by tradition in a lot of respects, and people do what they do because that's the way it's always been done. But I think there's a number of people that are pushing the envelope, and I think it's incumbent on us, the group that we've got here and the others that are out there that are pushing the boundaries. Again, we're not going to get everything right, but if someone's not out there working out what's not the best thing to do and then finding out the good things along the way, well, then we'll never advance the way the production systems have got to go into the future, because I don't see it staying exactly how it is at the moment. I think there's going to have to be some change, and we can all argue about how best that will happen. But I think we've just got to be open-minded enough to say that if Simon's trying something on his site, then we need to at least pay attention to it, because that actually might be the one thing that works, and likewise be open-minded to what people are doing and see what happens from there.
Now, did you want to chime in there, or should we move on to renewable energy? Because I know there was a question earlier asking about whether any of the farmers here today are using renewable energy on their sites, and if they're being recognised for that.
Actually, I would like to stay on topic for just a little bit, because certainly the issues in wool growing, I think, are a bit different. And maybe Tasmania is a bit different as well, but there's been very little uptake of the kinds of things I'm doing. Your comment about, usually the term is more like man is a box of frogs, rather than three heads. We're careful about those multiple head things in Tasmania. And I've thought a lot about it, because of course I get really excited. It's so cool. This is great. You guys should love it. All of the things that are really useful about what we're doing. But when I look at it sort of realistically, I think that the things that I started to do, partly as trying to get to be more resilient, both in terms of climate change, in terms of the landscape, and also financially, they involve things which are they're going to hit us all as graziers. We're going to have to reduce our stocking rate. We can't go on depleting the natural capital the way we're doing. But that said, and you look at what the margins are. If I talk to somebody and say, oh, well, look, you ought to reduce your stocking rate by 50%, and they're barely making it at 100%, they're not going to go there. So I think that there's got to be some structural things that help people to be able to make those transitions.
Like subsidies?
Well, I'm not, I'm reasonably independent, both by culture and also by, having become a farmer. I think I've taken it on. But so for instance, in my case, had I been able to get a loan that was, designed for someone trying to make this leap, I would have needed that kind of support for about 5 years, but I could pay it back now. I don't need it as a handout, but for most farmers who are farming at my scale, they just couldn't afford to do it. So I think that we have to be realistic about that and think about, how do you support, in a more structural sense, how do you support people so that they can have the courage to try things that might actually transform the way their businesses happen over time.
And Bridget, I'm not sure if you wanted to add to the conversation whether people think you're as mad as a box of frogs, I think it was.
It was.
Yeah. When you try to do things on your property, like ensure ground cover, and what sort of response have you had to that, Bridget?
No, I actually think we need to give more credit to producers, because at the heart of it, they understand that that's what they were called graziers. So, I consider my husband a soil scientist. So I think a lot of it is the narrative. And so because the narrative that we use is this is what we're doing, people come and ask us questions. The biggest challenge with climate change, or now the climate crisis, is when people engage with producers, often they'll say, and what are you doing about it? They don't say, well, as part of the solution. So the conversations that we have, people say, yeah, well, tell us about it. So we have put bores down. We have gone to solar. We'll look at doing solar buggies when the batteries get better. So because we have it at that conversational level of we're giving it a go, these are the results. And because we're more open, but it's only one of the topics and risks. So recently, last week, we had a field day on dieback, because that's a major issue for us. So, and it's only when you have those conversations in a safe environment that we had 50 other producers start to say, well, yeah, we've got it, we're worried too. But then we could say, well, here's an opportunity now that we're putting legumes in, because legumes aren't impacted, and that's going to put more phosphorus in, and that's actually short-term pain, but longer-term, much better turn-off rates for the cattle with growth. So no, generally I think because of the way we talk about it, and we don't judge other people, we just say we're giving it a go, that other people are more prepared to go, yeah, well, us too, tell us what you've learnt.
That's so great. I'm going to come back to these other inputs on the farm, like the batteries on the quad bikes, I think you said, Bridget. But just very quickly, Nan, Simon, Richard, you could give a one-word answer if you like, as to the renewable energy inputs, beginning with you, Nan.
Limited, a bit like Bridget. So I have an off-the-grid farmhouse, and I charge my electric Polaris from the grid, but there's nothing on any larger scale.
Okay, not quite a one-word answer, but very interesting nonetheless. Simon, what have you got in terms of energy at yours?
Yeah, we haven't got any renewable other than solar and wind for water pumping at the moment, but are looking into solar energy on our sheds, etc. at the moment.
And Richard, is there an option for you in terms of renewables?
Well, yeah, we're running solar to help offset electricity use in pumping water, and then for wine storage, all the wine storage shed is insulated and then uses solar for cooling offset as well. And
is that good financially for you? Does it make a difference?
It has done, yeah. It's very new for us, but the payback on the system will be probably inside of 3 years for us. So, and it's a significant size system. So we're now looking at why didn't we do it earlier discussion.
That's always handy.
Yeah.
We do have a question here asking about intensity of inputs, as well as what happens downstream in terms of freight and packaging. Obviously, you've got a lot of different things that you're considering in the McLaren Vale. What considerations, if any, do you factor in there?
Well, obviously, to do the carbon neutral certification, we had to include everything. So not only what we did on farm, but we were quite a unique case because we process off-site. Our wine production is off-site, so that business needed to be involved in the auditing process, and then of course we package off-site as well. So we had to get a great deal of collaboration from those two businesses. So that was all captured, and obviously anything that once it leaves the building, that needed to be factored in as well. So it was an intensive process, as you would expect. You know, packaging is going to be an interesting discussion long term for wine. You know, very traditional. There's no question that glass is our biggest footprint in terms of carbon. You know, the consumer understands glass. That's how they see premium wine, not in flat packs, not in boxes, not in cans. There's going to need to be some consumer education if this is something that people want to see as long-term change. I mean, from our business, we'd like to see it. There's a lot of advantages to getting away from round bottles to square containers, but we'll consume like a box, correct? And but will consumers perceive paying $30 for a box the same way as they perceive paying $30 for a glass bottle? So I don't think it's not doable, because 10 years ago cork was the only way we would seal wine bottles, and now we do them all with screw caps. So the consumer can be educated into change, but it's going to take time. So
making the green box.
Yep.
One of the great challenges.
Well, exactly right, and part of the problem is going to be stigma, of course, because that was always associated with low quality wine, and we're now going to be trying to get people to buy, high quality wine in those sort of containers. But again, it's the messaging that's important. Why are we doing it? And the reasons thereof will be part of the education process.
And Richard, as part of that certification for being carbon neutral and looking at your packaging, did you make changes to your packaging throughout that process, or you tried to offset that in a different part of the business?
No, so I mean, we're definitely in the offset phase of the whole thing, Kath. I mean, we've got some work to do. Part of that process was working out where our biggest consumables were, and it's no surprise that they're at the packaging end. I mean, the production side of things, we're pretty well covered. The winery we go to has got an enormous solar array, so they're covering actually a fair bit of their power use as well. So it's really at the product end, the packaging end, where we've got some work to do. But part of that's going to be difficult because that's going to be around consumer perception. But we're going to take that on board, and we'll do some work internally on that. And probably we're lucky we've got a consumer-facing outlet at the Cellar Door in Willunga, so we might trial a few things there, get some feedback from consumers. But that's going to be a long-term journey for our industry. But I think one that necessity will make us. We're going to need to have that conversation, because it's going to be it's the biggest part of the footprint for the industry, no doubt.
So not quite the pub test, but the cellar door test.
Correct. Exactly right.
Bridget, what do you do to consider? I mean, when we talk about red meat, there's a lot of steps in the processing chain and exporting. How do you consider that as part of your business, or do you not?
Yeah, look, I guess when I first looked into the carbon side of how do you become with the carbon certification, you do get a despondent, because a lot of the analysis at the moment is at that desktop level. And, even the big guys, there's cuts that are being marketed as carbon neutral, but they're only cuts within a beef, within a certain, few paddocks within a massive big corporate entity. So it is understandable why people are going, really, when will we get past it being a numbers exercise? So, so there's a lot of what ifs at the moment, but we just take it right back to what are the small things that we can do in our business, that we can contain with our business, because obviously some of the suppliers because we supply to, we don't go direct, our market is overseas, but we have to sell to the processors first. And there's massive freight costs involved in getting our product too. So I guess we need to see where those lines will be. Is it in our business? Is it where does our product actually stop and start in terms of how you would measure its carbon footprint? So what we're doing at the moment, we're just looking at those small things, such as looking at technology and saying, well, we've introduced remote water monitoring. So that's going to reduce, we don't have to drive now to check it. So I guess we're right at those steps, that what can we do within our business in preparation while we understand the bigger picture. And that's why we became involved in the DAF project that we did, trying to say, well, there's got to be options for producers like us.
I feel like I'm on the radio. It's just gone 5 o'clock here. We've got a few more minutes to go. If you do have any more questions that you'd like to put through to our panelists this evening, in fact, I will get back to the first question I was meant to ask. But before we do that, Simon and then to Nan, what about thinking about what's happening in terms of, Simon, you talk about chemical inputs, things are often coming from overseas. And then, of course, what happens down the supply chain if you're sending your barley to Mexico to make Sol beer or whatnot?
So from the input side of our operation, we as farmers believe that we're responsible for the on-farm emissions, and we have some control over that. However, it will be great if the whole supply chain gets involved in the solution. So, for example, nitrous oxide is one of our key emissions from fertiliser application. We can control that on farm to some extent with how we apply fertiliser, but the emissions of manufacturing the fertiliser are out of our control. And there's some work being done by some large fertiliser companies in using renewables to make fertiliser rather than natural gas or methane. So hopefully, and there is interest also from some of the agrochemical companies as well, such as Syngenta, in regards to how they as a company can reduce or become more sustainable, use sustainable inputs. So I think, generally the whole supply chain is looking at these things, but we're limited as farmers how we control outside the farm gate.
Maybe we'll be drinking our beer out of a box as well as our wine. Who knows? When we talk downstream. I was just thinking about glass. Sorry, I had a request. Nan, can you please step in and tell us about your concerns with the supply chain?
Look, I think it is a really interesting set of questions, and a lot of what Simon and Richard worry about, I think Bridget and I don't so much, because a lot of what we're trying to do is to absolutely limit the number of inputs. So, you know, with an organic certification, I don't have an organic certification, but Bridget and her husband do. You know, you're really trying to work within the natural system. And so I don't use any fertilizers, I don't use herbicides or pesticides. And in fact, a lot of the biodiversity on my farm, the sort of vast numbers of different species that animals have to graze are coming from the native environment, which is adversely affected by fertilizer. And of course, by herbicides, if you use those, excuse me. So the input side of things is not so much an issue. But I think that for me, what's happened as I've become so much closer to the end users of my fiber, I'm much more conscious of what they need in order to be able to say to their own customers, yep, this is what is actually happening, and this is why it's a good thing. So for instance, the fashion industry as a whole has recently adopted something called a responsible wool standard as their certification of choice. And I'm now certified RWS, as it's called, but that has to be certified at each step in the supply chain. So my mill would have to be certified, you know, et cetera. So I think that together with the, you know, the traceability issues are going to, it's going to be a set of challenges, much of which are outside of our direct control. But I certainly have been in the ear of the guys at my mill to say, you guys really need to do this. It's not just for me. This is something that's going to make your business more attractive to other people down the track. So I think we're going to see more of that kind of thing happening in terms of how the different variables that we're all concerned with are actually certified so that the end user can have confidence that we are all doing what we say we're doing.
What about your shearers, Nan? Are they emissions intensive? I guess if you have to fly them in from across the other side of the world, they could be, but
they would be. But mine just have up until last year have just come from up the street, so that hasn't been an issue. There are some other issues around shearing. It is not a very ergonomic process, and my shearers retired last year. It kind of left me in the lurch. So I am now buying what's known as a stand-up shearing platform, where the sheep is held and constrained and the shearer stands upright to shear. So hopefully that will actually help that whole situation long-term in terms of shearers' health.
Retired shearers and retired ewes. It sounds like you've got a few hangers on there, Nan. Just while we're on this question, Paul has asked Richard, if you were to shift to 1 litre bottles, do you think that would reduce the cost per unit in any way? I think he's trying to put off moving to the boxes.
Look, I think size plays a part, Kath, but also, I mean, bottle weight also plays a, you know, looking at, you know, limiting the amount of glass that we actually use in terms of bottle weight, the bottle structure, I think is a way of looking at it. Again, there's so much perception around quality in the wine industry around the touch and feel of these things when you pick them up. So that, you know, back in the, you know, certainly back in the mid-90s when I was a wine student, you know, the heavier the bottle, the bigger it was, the more expensive. It's bound to be good. Now I think that's been a misnomer along the way. It's self-perpetuating. I think we need to look at, okay, well, what's the lightest bottle we can get away with? So rather than looking necessarily at the package, the branding still plays a part, you know, a very strong part in the wine industry, but the bottle itself just needs a bit, you know, it just needs to be the receptacle. So how do we do that best? You know, is it bigger format? Is there different shapes? Is there weight issues? All of those things, and I'm sure it's been looked at, but we're obviously now, because it's been brought home to us, having done an audit, we need to be looking at it pretty strongly ourselves. So it's going to be a big discussion piece. I think I've said it in the industry moving forward, no question.
As a consumer, I have enough trouble corking it at 750 mils. I don't know that we shifted to litre bottles that would be good for some of us. Anyway, let's leave that issue there. There was a question that's just disappeared, but I thought it was really interesting. It asked about the certification process, and perhaps Bridget, you might want to pick this question up, moving to organic, just some of the costs that were involved in the process involved in getting that certification. Was that a deterrent, and have you got any advice to others that might be considering going down that path?
Look, the cost isn't too bad in terms of when you, I think it's about $2,500 for the actual audit when the auditor comes out. So when you look at, you can get up to a 30% premium when there is that real price differential. So no, definitely that audit, but in our terms of our business, a lot of stuff is in my husband's head. So there is a painful process in extracting it out of his head, particularly the best management practice certification process, to get it down and documented to be able to prove. And really I do run a few systems. One is to get the information from them, which I have a spreadsheet that I can then use to give that information over to how the auditors like it. So, and I'm lucky in my background is audit and compliance, but the biggest deterrent, I think, is because there aren't simple templates and pro formas for people just to go in. There's a lot of overwhelm in a lot of these processes, and people are so busy dealing with everything else and all the other hats that they wear. But the actual, financially, no, it's those other, family discussions that can come with, the lead up to an audit.
Well, that sounds like something that could perhaps be best left behind closed doors, if I'm picking up what you're saying, Bridget. Simon or Richard, I'm not sure if you've got anything to add about the cost of the certification process.
I've had a little experience with a market called the ISCC canola market in Europe. It hasn't specifically dealt with emissions yet, but I think that's not far away, but more generally sustainable farm practices. And every now and again, you'll get sort of drawn out of a hat, I assume, to be audited. And it took a bit of preparation, probably a day or two, to get all my records up to date and, available, but also just to make sure that my general farm practices were adherent to the sort of audit process in terms of how we store our diesel and oil and cope with spills and general workplace safety, etc. So, and I think it was a full day audit. So we get a $5 premium per tonne with that market. Even though it was a bit of time involved with that, I found it was generally a beneficial exercise to go through. So to go the next step to include emissions, I don't think will be a huge leap for us.
Kathy, yeah, I mean, the climate active audit that we did was a significant cost. There's no question. There's the farmer part of me would certainly say he did want to pay back because it certainly was time consuming and there's a reasonable amount of money in it. We were probably, again, we weren't a simple business to audit, so that's probably played a part. But there's part of it where it's just part of your DNA, and we accept the fact that a bit like Simon was saying before, if you're going to sing from the rooftop, then you've got to have skin in the game, and we just felt that this is part of leading, maybe change in their industry or change in our region or just change internally in our business. But our staff understand it. It's very easy to explain. So yeah, it's certainly a cost. I mean, we're also across the sustainability program that Wine Australia put forward, and we're going to audit that. So that that'll be another audit that we'll go through. So that, a bit like Bridget's saying, there is a little bit of overload on audits, and it would be nice to see a bit of overlap on some of this stuff, and maybe that will happen down the track because it wouldn't be difficult for us to roll into an organic audit, much like Nan's saying, we're basically we're pesticide, herbicide free, all of those things. We just haven't seen for wine at this stage the premium that required us to then go and do an audit and become organic. I think that's probably coming, and maybe that's why we've gone down the carbon path, because I think that's a market that's a bit more established for the discussion. But we could end up with 3 auditing processes and a reasonable cost just to get compliance. And I think there's a point somewhere where that's got to be looked at in terms of producers, who foots the bill for that, whether that's us or whether that's passed down the chain somewhere along the line, or whether that can be worked out at a government level, perhaps.
Yeah, well, I think that's something that this current federal government is trying to do with trials about how we are to measure both biodiversity and carbon if farmers are to either be incentivised and rewarded for that with the carrot, or cop the stick. I think that is a bit of a political debate that we're yet to undergo, but if nobody knows how to measure anything, there's no point really even getting to that stage. Nan, you look like you're ready to jump in.
Well, actually, I kind of wanted to jump in with a question for Simon and Richard and Bridget as well. And that is, it sort of comes back to this thing of, we're all experimenting. We're out there looking for different options, different ways to get certified, different ways to make our products traceable, out through the market. But then there's sort of government and research entities doing similar kinds of things, some of which look a bit like wallpapering over stuff, or not really getting down to the nitty gritty. Some of it just looks confused. So I think one of the things that's certainly true is each time that you invest in a certification process, it takes a lot of time, a lot of energy. Most of us have got many hats, and generally a year-on-year cost. So it's probably a sort of a Dorothy Dixer, really, but wouldn't it be great if there was some real consistency at a policy level that said, these are the issues, these are the things that we really need to make sure happen, and these are the ways that you could do it, rather than us having to sort of keep, not exactly reinventing, but exploring and then discovering, oh, well, actually that doesn't work for this market. Oh, that doesn't work for that market. So is this resonating with you guys?
It does with me, and I think what happened with our barley market in China is perhaps a case study we could use, in the fact that we put ourselves in a high-risk position as a country by allocating so much of one product into one market like that. And I thought I think the government really has a role in these things, in informing the market, and not just rely on market forces for this. So similarly, I think they have a role in this as well, in designing and the policy and providing some guidance around certification. So yeah, that's my view. I think the government has to be a lot more prominent in this.
Bridget or Richard, did you want to jump in before we wrap up?
I would probably say it also has to be more practical. So it has to really get the grassroots producers who have to implement a lot of these policies involved, and we really need to get better at. So when we did our best management practice, I deliberately set up an integrated system of how we record things. So we didn't just have one for workplace health and safety and something for another box to tick, but that was on our business to set up an integrated system. So I would think, if we could, there's a lot of great stuff happening, but what we're essentially missing in agriculture is the connecting loop between the people at the top and the people at the grassroots level.
I think that could apply to a few different areas of agriculture. Sorry, Richard, I cut you off.
Oh, no, it's fine, Katie. I mean, I agree with all of that, and I think there's a point. I mean, we understand that once we've set some of these platforms up, and I think that's part of the problem, is that you start from nothing, and then it takes, once you've got the processes in place, it's not as onerous a task. But it is. I mean, I'm not sure if Bridget knows, but I know that as a good friend of ours is an organic producer, and they need to have 3 different audits for different markets overseas. I mean, when there's duplication for one, what you would call standard being organic, that becomes onerous, and whether that's a policy thing that government or DFAT can play a role in trying to tie all these things together and saying, okay, well, surely we can have consensus across the world. Now that's probably a gilded cage that I'm looking at there, but it would be nice. I think at the end of the day, if you're out there having a go at trying to improve your system for the betterment of you know, the landscape and the community, then there's got to be some recompense back to the grower, whether that's, you know, payment or whether that's, you know, covering costs of auditing and at least doing the work. I think that's all part of the discussion for future.
There's so much more to this conversation, isn't there? And I have had a comment or a question come through asking about the lobby groups like the NFF and grain growers being able to influence this policy. I might get you to touch on that, but I will just, time is marching on, you know, we've got just a few minutes to go, and I know everyone's busy, but, and I just want to apologise. I feel like this conversation has been a little bit scattergun, and we've jumped all over the place and come at the issues from different angles, which, you know, is not a coherent timeline as perhaps it could have been, but that's just how the conversation's evolved. Each of you, or each of our panellists today was selected because of their approach to resilience and tackling some of these issues around climate and markets and market adaptation to the challenges of climate. And I thought it might just be a nice way to wrap up if each of our panelists would just perhaps maybe have some advice that they would like to pass on, something they wish they knew at the beginning of their various different approaches, you know, Nan, be it with you and biodiversity, or sort of taking over the supply chain as it will, or Simon with the grains industry as you approach, you know, 2030. Is there something that you know now that you wish you knew as you set out on this path? And Richard, because you're on screen, you can go first.
Well, thanks very much, Kath. It's throwing me right under the bus. Can you see me looking really thoughtful then? I was going to take my time. Don't wait, I suppose. You know, you've got to, I think if I go back to, I think I said it earlier, if you're waiting for the perfect solution, then you're just going to get run over. Just start. Now, whatever it is that you want to start, that's up to individual producers. But you know, just make a start at something. You know, if you wanted to make a change to your production system around an improvement in soil carbon or microbiology or whatever it is, then make a start on it. Don't wait to read and find someone who's been doing it perfectly, because it's going to be different in your site anyway. So that would be my only, I suppose it's a very simple takeaway, but whatever it is that's driving you, get started on it, because we're talking about changes that are going to take time. They're not going to happen overnight. So the sooner we get on the ground and running with it, the better. So yeah, don't wait.
Very succinct and clear message. Thank you, Richard. Richard, is there something that you've learned that you'd like to pass on?
I guess I've learned that it's about how we approach our conversations. Particularly with climate change, and that if we talk about seasonal changes, if we talk about, you know, what people are doing, and we don't seem to be attacking, but we seem to be inquisitive, and we have to get a lot better about being open about what we do, and talking numbers and figures. And the other thing too is really valuing the people within the departments, within our government departments, who do get quite a ear bashing at times, because there's a difference between political and departmental, and I think sometimes we forget that, but there's an amazing depth of knowledge and people get better for us. So that's one of the best things we've done. When we started to talk to them without being worried about sharing data and information, they've turned around and gone, oh, we could help you, or we could do this, or please let us be involved, and that's been really rewarding for us.
Great, that's a good one. There are some good people in the department willing to help. Nan, when you left the CSIRO and set out on your mission to be a farmer, what do you wish you knew?
Oh, golly, the number of things I didn't know. I can remember driving up the highway not long before I bought the farm, looking at sheep grazing and thinking, gee, how hard could that be? I think I was thinking about, there's several things that I could say, but the thing that sort of struck me while Richard was talking was that I went through quite a long phase where I would go and find an expert in whatever. And you know, perfectly sensible advice. And then I'd find another expert in a different area, perfectly sensible advice. By the time I got up to about 4 of them, they were starting to contradict each other. And so then I went through a phase of, okay, I've got to find the expert that will integrate all of these different sort of conflicting messages. And it was a really sobering moment to realize that I had to become my own expert for integration, because I'm the only one who's here, feet on the ground all the time. I'm the one who knows the uniqueness of this particular production system. Not to say that there aren't many, you know, underlying principles that operate right across the board, but in fact, every single production system is unique. And you know, it takes a bit of courage to go, okay, I may not actually know exactly how to do this, but I'm probably the only person in this picture who can do it for me. I'm the farmer, that's my job. And I wasn't expecting that. I really thought that there would be experts, you know, all the way through the system that would, you know, be there to support me. So I guess it's the lesson is to value what you know about your own system and work from that basis in ways that make sense, and that if you experiment, you have the courage to experiment, you will see over time what works and what doesn't work for you. I mean, I've talked to you about the things that worked. I haven't told you all the things that didn't work.
We might need to pencil in another session, Nan, from Nan the expert. Thank you. And Simon, a final word from you, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thanks, Kath. And I've got to say, these conversations do tend to jump around all the place. That's been my experience. There is a fair bit of confusion there, but I suppose, like Richard said, we just got to get it started and get into it, and things will tend to work themselves out. Obviously, staying informed, working as an industry together, and really, you know, encouraging the researchers, as Bridget said, to be courageous and keep. We really need that research behind us and work together as an industry. So, yeah, and it's all about being resilient. And I think if you're open to change and you stay positive, then you will continue to be a resilient farmer, and our communities will be resilient as well.
I feel like it's a bit of life advice, not just for farmers. Thanks very much to you, Simon, and to Bridget, Nan and Richard for being part of this conversation today. I think at this time, I might hand you back to Anwen. I hope that you'll appear in a moment, and it's quite a miracle, but we're going to be right on time. So a big thank you to all the panelists today and to all of those who've sent through their questions. I hope this has helped, and I've certainly enjoyed it from afar. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Kath, and I'm assuming you can all see me now, that my video's up and working. Look, I'd really like to particularly say thank you again to Kath, Richard, Bridget, Simon and Nan. We had a chat about doing this on Tuesday and everyone was up for a conversation. The whole idea was that this would be less structured than sitting through yet another series of formal presentations. So I hope people have enjoyed listening to the conversation and sharing your questions with us. That brings us to the end of day one of our online forum. We're back again tomorrow, and I hope as many people as possible can join us again tomorrow, where we're looking at some of the national and state programs, a number of the R&D corporations initiatives, and some presentations on some of the leading research that's being funded by the CRSPI partners at the moment. So thank you again to our panel for a really free-ranging conversation. I'm going to sign off there and let everyone go to their evenings, and maybe a glass of wine out of a bottle, Richard. Thanks everyone, bye-bye, and see you tomorrow.